Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming! Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, a podcast dedicated to a highly fixated review of large, dense books, specifically of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Kate, and I'm one of the co-hosts.
I'm Cody.
I'm Will.
And I'm Luke.
And today we're going to be returning to our old friend, who may never go away, Against the Day. And we are going to be discussing chapters 32 through 33, which comprises pages 429 through 459 of this particular behemoth. Somehow, after an entire calendar year, we are still not halfway through this book. Welcome back, everybody. It's been a while since all four of us have been together at once and also discussing this book in particular. What did we think about these chapters?
What a set of chapters to come back to. I had kind of forgotten how much I love these particular chapters. I think that what is happening thematically in both is of maybe the utmost importance of all the chapters we've read so far. I think this is like the sort of crucial, I don't want to say tipping point, but it's definitely, we're hitting a high note as far as understanding what the book's getting at from a thematic level. And I mean, on a sheer writing level, it's beautiful. There are some amazing passages in here, but the amount of character work and world building that's going on, in addition to the everything that's happening with the plot, just makes for two incredible chapters.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of these chapters are fairly simple. I mean, in summary, like the Chums go on an under sand adventure and don't find what they're looking for. That's essentially the first chapter. And the second chapter is essentially Merle gets a job at a theater and then goes to Candlebrow University and attends a couple of lectures. Like that's technically all that's really happening in these two chapters. Yeah, exactly. To the point where like, and I've mentioned this before, I manage a cafe and my employees have at various times asked me like what it is that I'm working on or what it is that we're covering for the podcast. And today, after I was done working my shift on the floor with them, I went and I sat down in the lobby and I finished doing my like notes and my research. And one of my baristas was like, "What are you working on?" And it was in the middle of me like writing out this long sort of, I guess, monologue that I'll get to at some point in this episode, from the second chapter, dealing with like all this stuff with Yates and the Gyres and the kind of like if we could reverse time or stop time and its effects on gravity thing. And I just sort of looked at them and tried to explain the best I could without this whole thing being, just a recap of everything Pynchon has been doing up to this point.
Yeah.
And they just gave me a complete look of like stupefaction. And they went, "How long does it take for you to do that show?" And I was like, "Well, we record for like 5-ish hours, 6-ish hours, and then it usually gets cut down to 4 hours." And then she just sort of like shook her head and walked away.
Yeah.
And that, I would say, about sums up my impression of these chapters really difficult to explain without all of the prior context of the book because of what's going on underneath the surface.
Yeah, I basically on the same page as Cody there. I'm a big fan of both of these, and kind of the same way that I was a big fan of the opening chapters of the previous part of section of the book, I guess. But it's they're it's not as though they are my favorite chapters necessarily. It's more that they are such an incredible torrent of actually moving the themes forward. Like, you know, Kate and I have been saying many times, perhaps more often than is fair, we were a little tired of the Iceland spar of it all. And we finally got all of the things that the Iceland spar was hinting at breaking loose and kind of coming together to affect the actual world of the book. Not necessarily in the way that the whatever it was that they took from the Arctic broke free, but things actually start culminating as a result of all of it. And so, like I said at the beginning of our of the Iceland spar section of this book, I said that it was kind of like reaching the apex of a roller coaster. What I neglected to say is that, to me, unfortunately, Iceland spar kind of feels like you're sitting at the top for the whole time. You're just waiting. And it builds a lot of tension, and there's a lot that you care about. But the longer you're up there, the bigger you get to see, the more you get to see what's going on the ground, and then drop.
Yeah.
And this is the beginning of that drop, and it's just insanely dense, and it's insanely heavy in exactly the ways that I love. And it's the kind of stuff that I really struggle to care about the character work or care about the plot, because why would I think about any of that when instead I could just spend hours reading about random weird scientific theories from 100 years ago, huh? But it's just fun. It is fun.
Yeah, I like what you all have said about these chapters, especially what Cody said about the thematic work that they're doing. I mean, there's just so much in here. There's a good amount of social commentary on the 90s and the early 2000s, especially the early to mid 2000s in here that I'm sure we'll get to, and I'm sure it was at least clear to y'all too. And I don't know. I mean, the second chapter, that's mostly in the first chapter that I found that kind of stuff. In the second chapter, I love all the Thorvald stuff. I kind of love this whole idea of Merle finding a refuge he can return to every summer at Candlebrow U. I have some stuff planned to talk about that relates to that. But yeah, there's a lot of beautiful prose in these two chapters. They're really fun to read. I mean, I did kind of complain when we were not recording about how difficult to parse the beginning of chapter 32 is, at least in terms of putting it together in your head of why is this happening and where is this happening and all this stuff. And I did feel like I could Kate helped me out a little bit, and then I do feel like it's not impossible to figure out. It's just it's a little bit. I don't know. Opening a section with such a difficult to understand couple of pages is very Pinchonian thing to do, I feel like. And I think I like these chapters probably about as much as the other co-hosts. So
I also think page for page, this might be the funniest set of chapters we've done.
Really?
There's a lot of shit that had me laughing.
I don't think I laughed one time.
Really?
One time.
I'm wondering if you caught all the same jokes that I did.
Maybe
Or
not.
I guess maybe you didn't.
I think
I kind of agree with Cody here, but the stuff I caught, I'm kind of with Cody on this. It's really, there's a lot of comedy in it, but I don't think it's really they're not jokes. They're weird puns on thematically related things for the most part that I caught. And they're just kind of goofy little bits. I kind of agree. Like I said, Cody is kind of right. It is very funny, and it might be the funniest for me, but it doesn't mean it's actually laugh out loud necessarily.
I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle.
I think just it's gonna be hard to top the pool ball thing.
Oh, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Fair.
It's like what Will said is that there's just a lot of little shit that pops up every night. I think I literally wrote one of my notes just says, "Come on."
Well, I mean, it's things like, I knew it. That Zoe Meatman was setting us up for suckers all along. As though that's relevant. What are you talking about, Darby? That's not a
Yeah.
thing. No one was thinking that. That doesn't come up. That doesn't relate. But it's pretty funny.
Before we get into the nitty gritty detail, do you have a summary prepared for us, Luke?
I do. Chapter 32. We begin with a flashback to the Chums' time in NYC, then flash forward to Lindsay traveling to rejoin the Chums. Then we fill in the blank in between those two events. The Chums set off on an undersand adventure aboard the Saxowl. On their way to Shambhala, they encounter a strange amount of notable sights. Then they finally arrive at Nuovo Rialto, where they take shore leave. In a saloon, the Chums encounter a pair of oil prospectors who reveal to the boys that their mission to find Shambhala may just be a cover for oil prospecting in the region. The Chums return to the inconvenience where Pugnax awaits them. Next, they fly away, soon to find out that the Saxowl was attacked and destroyed, possibly due to the fact that it was carrying their copy of the Sfinchuno itinerary. Possibly the only survivor, Gasperow, an officer of the Saxowl, is ordered to make his way back to England and warn the government about how the powers that be are openly competing for dominance in the area. Once arrived home, Gasperow is so desperate to connect with Inspector Stans that he poses as an anarchist terrorist and gets himself arrested. Only then is he able to warn the British government about the emergency in the Far East. Next is chapter 33. Merle goes through his stuff, looking for pictures of Dally, then leaves his life in Colorado behind to quest for something, anything, he hadn't found on their way west. He finds jobs in small towns as a film projectionist and eventually makes his way to Candlebrow University, which becomes a home away from home of sorts for him. During Merle's first visit to the campus, he encounters the university's resident tornado, Torvald. Later, once Candlebrow has become the place he returns to every summer, he rekindles his connections with the Chums and Roswell Bounce. Indeed, Merle and Roswell's conversations dominate the rest of the chapter.
All right, so beginning with chapter. Do you realize that the notes document is chapter 18?
Yeah, I just pulled a random one out of the Google Drive.
Beginning with chapter 18, we're going all the way back to The Light Over the Ranges.
Context.
Yeah.
Beginning with chapter 32, we find ourselves with the Inconvenience still about to head out from New York, but they are leaving Lindsay behind. And Lindsay has been struck with a sort of great desire to be married. And as a result of that, he needs to be visited and examined by some doctors and psychologists to figure out what's going on with these signs of his, as Pinchon will put it, incipient gamomania, which, if you translate, is essentially just marriage madness.
Yep.
The abnormal desire to be married. I sort of just take this as a illustration of the fact that they're getting older. Like, obviously later in these chapters, it's also described from Roswell's point of view that it's hard to tell or recognize the Chums because one of them has like a mustache, like a pretty thick one at this point. That's how I take this. Does anyone have anything else they want to throw out there as far as why all of a sudden Lindsay wants to be married or has this big desire to be married?
I don't necessarily think that it's a sudden thing. I think he mentions even that it's been something that he's had for a long time. But I think that part of it also is, and this will come up again later in this end of this chapter. So we have to keep in mind that they literally are characters in a book and real people at the same time. So as
Especially
characters,
at this point.
right? And as characters, they're really not aging, or if they are, they're aging very slowly in comparison to real life. They kind of exist on this like event horizon of the story and reality. So they are aging, but they're definitely not aging at the same rate that the other characters in the book are, the real people, so to speak. But I think also as a character, I think there's always that one character in the boys' adventure novels that his whole thing is that gallant hero who wants to be married and have a family and raise a child who will go off and become an explorer as well. So I think part of it is that he's also just playing into that character.
Yeah, that kind of leads into what I was thinking, which is, I mean, two angles, I suppose. One is along those lines. The fact is that Lindsay's the most neurotic of all of the people on The Inconvenience.
Yes.
By a huge margin. And all of them, every single one of them, except for maybe the captain, have expressed like real sexual desire and romantic feelings. Maybe not in the sense that it's like at the forefront of their mind all the time, but they clearly have those feelings. And Lindsay's totally the kind of guy who would come up with a justification for being horny. And I think that's an important layer there. And then on another level, less about like why Lindsay is this, and more why does the Chums of Chance diagnose him with it, and not as in he doesn't seem to have a particularly obsessive romantic view, but also that they are like the most jingoistic organization you can imagine.
Yeah.
And there's very little that's more American in 1905 or whenever this is precisely than marrying one wife, having 8 children, being a good American yeoman in the model of Thomas Jefferson. And, you know, the kind of the whole issue with the Chums of Chance, as far as the Chums themselves are concerned, and as far as we've kind of seen it, is that they are not really people. And we can see it as them being framed as fictional, but we can also see it as them being controlled by this organization that they were essentially sold into, whether or not anyone got paid for it. And now they're stuck and they're working in this pseudo-military organization where they are not allowed to express any kind of normal human emotions, really. And, you know, so they prescribe, or they, sorry, they diagnose Lindsay with gamma mania, which is kind of similar to what was still being written about as a real thing up until 1914, drapetomania, the supposed mental illness of slaves wanting to be free.
An insane concept if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, no, I mean, if someone owns you, you should be happy with that. Just like Lindsay should be happy with the fact that he's not allowed to be horny.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not 100%. Sorry, I'm not 100% that the diagnosis and everything that follows isn't somehow manufactured. I can't really think of a reason, but it seems kind of nebulous. And like the Chums of Chance comprehensive annual coverage agreement thing is a little bit like maybe an excuse just to take him out of commission or to separate the other chums from him or something. Where I don't, if I were him, I'd be a little bit more doubtful of the things that I was being told by them. And like, you know, there's all this stuff about they're demanding samples of his bodily fluids, like unannounced visits from bespectacled, bearded gentlemen. Like they're obviously kind of bothering him. I don't really know what they're after. I don't have any theories as to what they're after, but it doesn't strike me as like, even for the time, like a super like, you know, scientific or like medical, you know, thing that is going on. I don't know if I'm really phrasing that correctly, but I also wanted to point out that this section is called by locations, and Lindsay's little monologue about how, you know, he's diagnosed with the abnormal desire to be married, and he says, abnormal, what's abnormal in that? When have I ever kept it a secret that my governing desire in life is to be no longer one but two, a two which is moreover one, that is innumerably two yet, which is bilocation is what he's talking about. I mean, it's a metaphor for marriage, but he's, you know, if you take it literally, he's basically just talking about bilocation, which I found interesting. And yeah, I mean, I know some people that, you know, that were raised super Christian and are Christian, and, you know, perhaps they got married in a Russian manner because they, you know, had some physical urges that they wanted to fulfill and they weren't
Mhm.
allowed to. That happens even today, and that we don't know if Lindsay's saving himself for marriage, but it's possible, and that kind of thing goes on and definitely went on 120 years ago. I mean, and it still goes on
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. And well, so I want to add a couple of things to that. I agree with everything that you said. So it's this is one of those things where I kind of got a chuckle from this, but like the fact that their agreement is called caca, like it's shit. Like it's obviously shit. They seem to know this, and then the test they run on him is the Biometric Institute of Neuropathy, the BIN. So I mean, it's clearly playing on these tropes of like, he's crazy, or this, there's this shitty force that's moving behind the scenes to do all these things to him. So I think that's definitely there. And then as far as the bilocation thing, that I think is something that also pops up a lot in this chapter especially, but in both chapters really. This sort of that duality thing that kind of we've been popping up every now and then in a lot of these chapters, like it really hits up a lot in this chapter.
Well, and just one thing to kind of link into the whole Kaka structure is that these are the health insurers checking him out. These are the people who are footing the bill,
Right.
not independent doctors, and their life doesn't afford them the ability to go see a doctor randomly, because of course it's 1905 or whatever. They're not going to go see a doctor annually unless they're required to, and this is not someone they can trust automatically, like you said, Luke, like you said, Cody. This is a clear scam. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time with like employment agreements or like employment insurance coverage. Thank you, mouth. And a lot of people are required to be seen by doctors who have nothing but the interest in saving money at heart.
All right. So this leaves Lindsay with a need to catch up with the group. And so after he gets discharged from the shadowy doctors and psychologists who have been examining his gamma mania, he makes his way on the back of a I think it's just a donkey or a camel. It doesn't, I think, specifically say. It's compared to Balaam's ass, but that's also just using a specific story from biblical literature.
I do think it does. It is a camel. It does say on 433. It is a camel.
Oh, okay. Yes, you're right. And as he begins to go across the desert to meet up with the inconvenience, he starts to hear voices. He mentions somewhere in here on 432, Lindsay reassured the camel. If I could just read, I would understand what animal he's on top of. It's quite common out here, reported as long ago as Marco Polo. I've personally run into something like it in the far north as well. Yes, plenty of times. Now, of course, we've talked about that a little bit in the sense of the kind of, what is it, like the third man syndrome or something like that people experience that gets referenced earlier in the book. But this is something similar to that in these different sounds or voices that people hear. You can actually find the quote that he's likely referring to in Marco Polo. The quotation that he's referring to is likely this. I pulled it. It's from the Travels of Marco Polo. When a man is riding by night through this desert and something happens to make him loiter and lose his companions, and afterwards he wants to rejoin them, then he hears spirit talking in such a way that they seem to be his companions. Sometimes, indeed, they even hail him by name. Often these voices make him stray from the path so that he never finds it again. And in this way, many of travelers have been lost and perished. And sometimes, in the night, they are conscious of a noise like the clatter or of a great cavalcade of riders away from the road. And believing that these are some of their own company, they go where they hear the noise, and when day breaks, find they are victims of an illusion and in a wayward plight. Yes, and even by instruments, especially drums and the clash of arms in the daylight, do men hear these spirit voices. So just more sort of terrifying stuff that you encounter psychologically out in the desert. Deserts in particular are something that I've always found particularly terrifying, like the kind of deserts that they're traversing at this section of the book because of things like that. Like seeing a mirage is one thing where, dehydration or desperation is causing you to hallucinate like an image of some kind. But hearing stuff like drums or the clatter of like weapons or arms off over the distance just showing up in your head is it's something about that stands out as being distinctly more psychologically terrifying to me
Yeah.
than just sort of being tricked into thinking there's water somewhere.
Yeah, and I think it is a little easy to maybe mystify those kinds of experiences a little bit more than is, I think, realistic, because in the same way that an oasis, part of it is desperation and your psyche just being tired of seeing the exact same thing, but it's also partially like heat waves coming off the sand and shadows. In that same way, the weird spear rattling in the distance is probably like wind blowing some leaves that happen to be at the mouth of a canyon that is so far away, but there is literally nothing in between the listener and those leaves, that it just has rattled for miles and become something unrecognizable. Plus, your brain slowly losing track of reality. That too.
And we get a reference here as he begins to make his way back to the Mirage where he will find his companions, to the phrase World Island. This will come up a couple of times over the course of this set of chapters. This is a historical term that was utilized as a phrase to describe sort of the continent of Asia. In case you happen to be like a middle schooler, Asia is the largest continent on the planet Earth.
Whoa, slow down. Hold up.
And there was a particular fixation with Asia, as we'll get into once there's a couple of different explorers referred to once they get into the Saxel. There was a fixation with Asia by some of the great Western powers in the kind of jockeying for land and territory that led up to World War I and particularly a little bit beforehand, where they had a fixation on Asia as this, like, as this phrase indicates, this great world island where there's not really any like bodies of water like oceans or giant seas that interrupt it. You could traverse the entire thing by rail. It would be very hard to invade and capture the entire thing. And so, as we'll get into once these explorers are brought up, there was a fixation of developing spheres of influence by these great Western powers in Asia in an effort to find a way to compartmentalize the continent into smaller pieces that you could then string together to control the entirety of the continent. And then that would somehow be kind of an unassailable fortress. Now, to the modern person, that's an insane concept because Asia is so diverse, not only in people groups and in terrain and like climate, that it would be just plain difficult to do that. But as the Ottoman Empire experienced, contemporary to a lot of the stuff within this book, you can only expand so far before the ability for you to actually govern the provinces that you're in charge of really becomes diminished. And that's what would have happened if these Western powers were successful in colonizing the world island in the way that they wanted to. But it is, again, just one of these other kind of interesting historical phrases that Pynchon is throwing out there to better indicate to the reader some of the context behind a lot of this stuff. This book, especially in these two chapters, I would say, is really developing this kind of unified theory of the death of the 19th century and the arrival of the 20th century and the changes over of these epochs. And this conceptualization of, I guess you could say, a gentler form of colonialism where you develop a sphere of influence rather than like an actual colony in kind of a heart of darkness sense, was a prevailing thing that we still do now. Why are there like 600 U.S. military bases on foreign soil? So that development in and of itself is important to the kind of world that Pynchon is depicting that we're turning over to. And so just keep an eye out for that phrase and other things that may indicate things akin to that. But Lindsay does end up finding the inconvenience and his companions, and they leave their ship to be protected by some Gurkhas, which are pro-British Nepalese forces from the time period, and they get aboard the how do we want to pronounce this? I was doing Saxol in my head, but I don't know if it's a reference to a specific thing that they've named this this vessel under.
I don't know that I know the proper pronunciation of it. Saxol is how I've been saying it also. I mean, it may be wildly wrong. I don't know.
That was my assumption as well. Yeah.
There's no accents or anything.
Yeah, they are brought above the, as it puts, Her Majesty's sub-desertine frigate Saxel. Diamond-edged sand augers cranked up to operating speed, beginning to bite all but frictionlessly into the sands of the inner Asian desert, as steering vanes smoothly came into play, increasing the angle of penetration. Any observer upon a nearby dune might have watched, perhaps in superstitious terror, as the craft, unhurriedly pursuing its dive into the lightless world, at last vanished beneath the sands, only a short-lived dust devil remaining behind where the fantail had been. And essentially, this craft is capable of digging underneath the sand dunes to reveal not exactly the Hollow Earth Society, but towns and cities that exist beneath the sand, essentially, and that are populated, that have been colonized at periods during human history, and still have active populations of people. This is a fascinating concept that Pynchon is working with here, in the sense that it is distinct from his Hollow Earth or Agrathea concept, whatever word you would want to use for it. But I'm sure it's been done in like a lot of kind of shitty paperback science fiction from the 60s, but it feels like a very distinct, almost work of genre fiction that he's generating at a midpoint in his book here, for no other reason other than how neat it is, I guess, is the way that I would put it.
I think there might be more going on than that.
I mean, thematically, yes, but like, there's no reason that these things need to be under the sand, I don't think, unless you disagree.
Well, it's not that I disagree. Okay, so I have a lot to say about this chapter. Okay, firstly, I'm shocked that the Pynchon wiki didn't point out the similarities between the opening line of this section of this chapter and the beginning of the book, because that's kind of a big thing. Now set the special desert detail, secure hatches fore and aft, all hands prepare to submerge. Very similar to now single up all lines, cheerily now, handsomely, very well, prepare to cast her off. But also this is the section that is titled as by locations. And so what better way to start it than how you started the beginning of the book, when they were starting to begin their journey to go to the World's Fair. So now they're going to a different place underground. It's the inversion of everything that they did at the beginning of the book, halfway through the book. And I think that that's kind of the interesting thing when you were talking about how it's not the Hollow Earth that was mentioned earlier. This is more of, it's the, for lack of a better term, it's like the upside down world version of it, right? It's the inverted part of it. And so this, at the end of this paragraph, only a short-lived dust devil remaining behind where the fantail had been. If you, and I'm getting way ahead of ourselves, but if you jump to page 452.
Jesus.
Yeah, no, I know this. Believe me, I was on some fucking rabbit holes. 452. That's where we have the tornado that comes in. So right. There could be, and this is a lot of speculation, right? But there could be a link. This is the first time they go down underground. They leave a dust devil. Every action has to have a reaction, especially in a situation like this where we're talking about duality. So that would manifest itself on the other side of the world as a tornado. So I think there's a lot going on here that's starting to connect the two stories that are simultaneously kind of careening towards each other.
Yeah, there's also like this level of thematic analysis that I think is useful, because you have kind of the contrast, obviously, between the air and the sand as, depth and height, but you don't have the ocean. You don't have this other place that is presumed to be full of life. It's almost like it's trying to get at like simply the blind spots of our reality. Because like if you're in the Sahara or the Mojave or the Gobi Desert or any other major desert on the planet, there is life underground constantly. Like anything that seems desolate, you go 2 feet underground, and sure, it might not be as dense as like a forest or a wetland, but you got moles, you got worms, you got beetles, you got all sorts of things living in the sand. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like just kind of digging into the fantasy of being able to traverse anything that you come across. Pardon the pun. And it's digging into that in a way that almost kind of implies like faultiness with the idea of trying to supersede these kinds of barriers rather than really embed yourself within them in the digging into the ground rather than trying to fly over it. Even if obviously you have to dig into the ground to get to wherever their destination is, it's almost like it's getting at like, if you're flying over the desert, you're missing the point. If you're going into it, if you're actually living in the desert, you are not necessarily missing the point. Almost, I don't know. That's pure speculation, but feels.
Well, I think it's also interesting that it is a distinct place in the sense that it's not the Hollow Earth, because if the Hollow Earth within this kind of Pynchonian framework is representing this inner world of mystery and Edenic beauty and magic, and the outer world is the kind of place of evil capitalism and destruction, then it seems important that from a purely geological perspective, a midway point is where something like Shambhala, this sort of like human-built civilization of spiritual enlightenment that does have, in theory, like godlike beings that dwell in it, is somewhere in between. Some of that also seems to be relevant to me in terms of thinking why it's situated the way that it is.
Anyway, that's the beginning of my crazy takes that are going to come throughout this chapter.
Well, cut me off whenever you have one of them, because your point about the tornado is a good one.
Believe me, I will.
We also should, give Torvald the respect of referring to him properly as Torvald.
Sorry.
As they begin to dig through the sand, we do get a reference to this place as the jagged mountain range is known to longtime inner Asian sand dogs as the Deep Blavatsky. This, of course, is another reference to Madame Blavatsky, who began the Theosophical Society, as we talked about several episodes ago, probably actually like half a year ago at this point, and is sort of, I think, again, indicative of the fact that we are stepping into a realm that is bridging kind of the gap between humanity and spirituality. That seems to be a very purposeful choice by Pynchon. As they dig through into the sand and try to make their way towards the holy city utilizing this map that they've obtained, we are introduced to a new character, Stilton Gaspereau, which is quite a character name, quite a Pynchonian name. He is the kind of navigator that they are going to work with, and he, utilizing a piece of Iceland spar and several pieces of lighting equipment, along with the map, kind of dictates to the chums that finding Shambhala or locating this kind of holy city is not going to be as easy as they assume it is going to be, and that instead, if he kind of adjusts his lenses and he looks at it, they may need to do more digging than they had expected, and they're gonna be headed towards first the city of Nuevo Rialto. Before they get there, though, this concept is introduced dealing with the Manichaeans. Before I get into that, do we have anything that we want to talk about of the establishment with Stilton Gaspereau, his Iceland spar lenses, anything that kind of bridges the gap there? Because there's a lot to talk about, obviously, within Manichaeism, and I have a lot of stuff prepared on it.
Yeah, we did do a disservice by not mentioning Captain Toad Black's great name. I don't think he's come up before, right? This is the first time we've seen.
This is when he's introduced. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Other than that, yeah. This is my stupid Simpsons brain. The urban terrain doesn't mean quite what it does up above. Not if we can approach a town from below as easily as any other direction. Two ways to look at that. This ties into the whole as above, so below thing that I think is also part of this inversion of the world. But at the same time, I know Matthew 24 through 27 because of The Simpsons, the foolish man who built his house on sand, just because that's a thing that lives in my brain from an episode where Reverend Lovejoy was debating Homer about something stupid. So I love seeing that pop up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great section for technobabble, and Pynchon does technobabble well, and it gets at what I think is a far more interesting angle on the same stuff he was doing with the Iceland spar earlier, because it's actually being put into practical use in a way that
Thank you for saying that. That was exactly how I felt as well.
like it's I think you could argue that a lot of the uses previously were practical and or like sci-fi-y in a way that was enjoyable, but they were all very similar, and this is a very novel introduction because it does start to bring in kind of the world, the more electromagnetic stuff beyond light itself, which is, I think, more interesting and pretty goddamn important. And the fact that it just focuses on the visual spectrum for like 100 pages gets to me.
Yeah. Some historical context before we get into Manichaeism is in order as well, because Stilton Gasparo is described as someone who proved to be a scholarly adventurer in the inner Asian tradition of Sven Hedin and Aurel Stein. Though beyond the navigation room chores, his status on the ship was unclear. Unforthcoming about himself, he appeared more than willing to talk about Shambhala and the Sfincunio itinerary. These two explorers are pretty important for the reasons that I kind of already introduced. Both of them specialized in the continent of Asia for the Western powers. Stein was educated in Germany. He was responsible for uncovering the Diamond Sutra, which is the world's oldest printed text. It's estimated the one that they found to be from 868. He also discovered 5 letters written in Sogdian. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing any of these. I don't have a great grasp of kind of Eastern languages. In an abandoned watchtower that have been dubbed as the Ancient Letters, as well as several other important oasis sites and ruins of prior Buddhist and Taoist civilizations. He has been roundly criticized since contemporary time when he was working as having been a serial thief of artifacts and not specifically stealing them for his own purpose, but taking them out of the sites that he finds them and then bringing them back to the Western powers. It's estimated that he stole 24 cases of manuscripts over the course of his career, as well as 4 cases of paintings. Returning a lot of this stuff to the British Museum in particular earned him a knighthood, despite the fact that he was not of British descent. He's from Germany. He was also seen as a major player in the Great Game, as I kind of introduced at the top of the chapter, along with Sven Hedin, in which the great powers of Western Europe were sponsoring explorations in order to build spheres of influence in a bid to control Asia. Most of his finds are actually still stored in the British Museum and the British Library, where they are still available to be seen and kind of worked with archivally with people who work in that field. Some things have been returned to separate sort of Asian countries or museums in the continent of Asia or libraries in the continent of Asia, particularly in India. But a vast majority of the things that I'm just going to say pillaged, have remained in Western countries.
Not to cut you off, but he did also write Goosebumps. R.L. Stein? We're talking about the same?
Yep. Same guy.
Yeah, okay.
I think I'm going to go walk into the lake now, actually, because I think
I had to. I'm sorry.
That pun reset my brain in a way that it's pretty hard to articulate verbally.
I'm really glad that I held off on my joke, which I was going to say right off the bat.
Which was?
Oh, just the same as Cody's. Just
great.
Good.
Derailed you earlier.
I had to sit on that for forever. I'm like, this is really cool information that I'm learning about this guy. It's terrible that I'm going to ruin it all with this stupid ass joke.
Sven Hedin was a bigger figure of the period. If R.L. Stein is Luigi, Sven Hedin is Mario, of this sort of exploration of Asia on behalf of the Western powers. He was a massive figure in Central Asian studies. He published numerous works and was responsible for making and mapping several lakes and rivers in Asia known to the West. Obviously, these things were known and mapped to the indigenous populations, but in terms of actually revealing them to the Western powers, he was a crucial figure in doing so. There's a list of those different things that you can find on Wikipedia that he quote unquote discovered, and then he wrote volumes and volumes and volumes of cultural information that he found across 4 distinct investigations or inspections and tours of Asia that he went on. He was also responsible for discovering and mapping a large portion of the Great Wall of China that was previously not thought to be there by the Western powers because it was so far from kind of the starting point of that building project. So huge debt of gratitude from a archaeological perspective is owed to him for continuing the process of uncovering just how big of an architectural project the Great Wall was. He was foremost an authority in Asian studies, and he completed wide-ranging expeditions across the entirety of the continent. He would also be responsible for propagating the use of 19th century techniques into the 20th century when it came to exploration. It is unclear what that means. I was not able to find like a helpful resource on what the difference is between 19th and 20th century exploration when it comes to actually going on an expedition. But especially given that this book has to do so much with the death of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, that felt like relevant information to include here. His life gets a little complicated after this because he developed very pro-German ties during World War I. He was supporting the empire's position as it related to the justification for its entrance in World War I throughout the entirety of the war, and he remained a supporter of Germany through to the Nazi regime, to the point where he was like he was a avowed collaborator of the Nazis throughout the entirety of World War II, and afterwards did not go back on his sort of Nazi collaboration because in his mind, it allowed him to help get people out of the concentration camps. I can't find any proof that he did that in my research about the guy. He was so popular with the Nazis that they named universities after him. They gave him numerous awards. There is some references that I was able to find that some of that was recanted later in the Nazi regime before the dissolution of Hitler's empire. But I cannot find any good resources on who he helped out of the concentration camps, if anyone, or what a schism may have been that developed between him and the Nazis. Because again, he did not disavow his actions with them after the war was over. So there's a lot of, I think, still maybe competing misinformation there of him trying to whitewash his involvement in it. He also was a supporter of the Nazis during World War II, initially because he believed that it would keep the Soviets from invading Sweden, which is obviously where he was born and where his sort of cultural identity resides. And as it continued through the war, again, he claims that he was engaged in some degree of emancipation, but again, I cannot find any sort of proof of that. Interestingly, though, there was a member of the Volkish Thule Society present on one of his expeditions into Asia. Not to get into a whole discourse on Nazism, but the Thule Society was like the weird precursor to the Nazi Party, where like a who's who of the founders of the Nazi Party were in the Thule Society, and they were the kind of weird occult element of the Nazi regime. They were super interested in the occult and in the kind of supernatural. That's where Hitler got a lot of his influence in that regard. They were kind of, their main stated goal was working towards like a unified theory of the Aryan as a race of people. And especially later in his career, and this is where it gets again related back to not just the undersand stuff, but some of the other stuff with Against the Day, Hedden became obsessed with an attempt to locate Agartha, which was a kingdom proposed to be on the inner surface of the earth. Agartha would go on to greatly influence the hollow earth theories that developed later, and was a very, very popular subject in the 19th century occultism, and was really, really associated with and often confused with the idea of Shambhala. So within a lot of these different metaphysical societies, they would use those terms sometimes interchangeably. Some of them would also pit them against one another, where they would say that Agartha represents the good path and Shambhala represents the bad path, or vice versa. There were all sorts of different viewpoints on what that would have meant. But again, it is interesting who he's choosing to reference, because not only are these people important to the kind of Western understanding of Asia at the time, but they are, especially in the case of Sven Hidden, also related to this weird sort of occult spiritualism thing that Pynchon is also working territorially with against the day, especially, with something like Agartha that has to do with not just Shambhala, which is germane to this chapter, but also, is associated with the Hollow Earth in like a very real way, because it's one of the earliest theories of this idea of a civilization on the inside of the planet, which we've talked at length about the importance of that to Pynchon's mythology over the course of its whole fucking show that we've done. So super interesting historical figures in that regard if you end up researching them. There is also a reference to a Nernst lamp that is utilized in the navigation chamber, and that is a reference to Walther Nernst, who was a German physical chemist and is best known for developing the third law of thermodynamics and the Nernst equation, which deals with electrical potential. He developed the lamps that are mentioned in the quote in 1897 at the University in Göttingen, and they are actually still used in infrared spectroscopy or spectroscopy devices. I don't know how that word is pronounced. And here's where he gets weird. Upon the breakout of World War I, he was a signer of the Manifesto of 93, which was a declaration by artists and scientists and cultural figures in support of Germany at the outset of the war. His own sons would enlist in the army, and he would serve as a scientific liaison to the military forces in Germany. He was actually given 2 Iron Crosses for his work with the German military in World War I.
Oh, wow.
One of them was in helping develop trench mortars for the purpose of trench-to-trench combat. The other one is much darker, though, because he was the guy who suggested using gas as a weapon in
Like chlorine
World
gas?
War I.
Is that what they were using in World War I?
Yeah, well, that's what they ended up using. He wanted them to use tear gas, and they were unable to develop a quantity of tear gas enough that would be effective to clear out the trenches, so they used chlorine gas instead. And obviously that opens up a whole can of war crimes that World War I is very much known for still to this day. That originates with this guy. And because of the fact that the first time they used them, it was not sufficiently backed up by like an infantry charge, because it's chlorine gas, it stopped being a utilization for like defense breaking maneuvers, and it started to be used just as an offensive measure, which obviously devolved into a whole thing in World War I. Also interesting about this guy is he tried attempting to advise the Kaiser to not engage in mass submarine warfare because of the fact that he was concerned about the US entering the war, and that Germany was not going to want to have to deal with the US as another opponent in that conflict. Obviously, the Kaiser did not listen to that, because a huge precursor to the US entering the World War I, if you're not aware, is the torpedoing of the Lusitania, which was a passenger vessel that was destroyed by a German underwater boat, a U-boat or submarine, as they called it back then. And that was a big precipitating factor of the US finally deciding to enter the war. So again, another case of just like a really fascinating person from history that is being directly referenced here in something very, very simplistic, and a good illustration of why these names are important to look up if you're trying to understand the broader ways in which Pynchon is articulating how, at this stage of development and civilization, power is connected through the sciences and through the arts and through cultural forces to uplift towards something as evil and as pointless and as wrong as World War I, which as soon as that ball got rolling, it's kind of never stopped. I mean, Peter Thiel just had like a big retreat that a bunch of like cultural figures and artists were at over this past like week. So again, I cannot state it enough. If you're looking into a close reading of this book, it is important to do the amount of research that I am doing as well, because it really does illuminate a lot more about the text.
Yeah, and I'd just like to insert a note when we're
Yeah.
talking about people like Nernst or and a little like Fritz Haber, one of his essentially peers. All of the guy, the Maxim, I can't remember his first name at the moment. These people who designed these engines of war that in hindsight we see as on a spectrum leading to, the atom bomb and like just these things that seem utterly despicable and indefensible. The important thing to consider is the incestuousness of European thought at the time. And to situate yourself as a German looking at the world around you and looking at the UK, who are by far the most successful empire on the planet still at that point, and how they are using crowd control mechanisms in Africa to maintain control of their colonies and to break resistances in Kenya, for instance. So when you talk about like why they use gases in the war, sure, tear gas is one of those things where, hey, it's not that bad, right? Except it's still against the Geneva Convention, and it's not in there as a technicality, despite what some people may imply. It's still poison. It's still horrible. It still causes permanent damage to your body. And these other more toxic poisons are they were developed and put into use with this absurd mentality that if you simply use enough bullets, if you simply flood the trenches with enough mustard gas, the people in charge of the wars will stop fighting. And that didn't work. It never worked. And the only time it did work, really, was the atom bomb in World War II for kind of obvious reasons. And it's one of those things where, in hindsight, we can very easily think of these choices as purely motivated through greed or less than virtuous intentions. But people like Nernst thought they were helping in a horrible, screwed up way. They truly thought they were somehow preventing the suffering of the young men who would die to these things.
That's a really good point.
All right. And in case you haven't gotten tired of me talking yet, you're going to be by the time I'm done talking about Manichaeism.
Yay.
So on page 437, we start with Nernst on the top of the page and we end with Mani by the end of the page. It reads here, the ancient Manichaeans out here worshipped light, loved it the way Crusaders claim to love God for its own sake, and in whose service no crime was too extreme. This was their counter-crusade. No matter what transformations might occur, and they expected anything. Travel backward or forward through time, lateral jumps from one continuum to another, metamorphosis from one form of matter, living or otherwise to another. The one fact to remain invariant under any of these must always be light. The light we see as well as the expanded sense of it prophesied by Maxwell, confirmed by Hertz, along with what went a refusal of all forms of what they defined as darkness. Everything you appreciate with your senses, all there is in the given world to hold dear, the faces of your children, sunsets, rain, fragrances of earth, a good laugh, the touch of a lover, the blood of an enemy, your mother's cooking, wine, music, athletic triumphs, desirable strangers, the body you feel at home in, a sea breeze flowing over unclothed skin, all these for the devout Manichaean are evil. Creations of an evil deity, phantoms and masks that have always belonged to time and excrement and darkness. Now, Manichaeism is something that I was aware of through my time at seminary, primarily because St. Augustine, who is a very, very famous saint in the Catholic Church and just a writer and theologian by the Protestant Church, was at one point in his life a Manichaean. He was not a perfect, as is later sort of elucidated in the text here where they explain the difference between them. He was just a hearer, which meant that he had to support the perfects. But eventually he grew disillusioned with the religion and he converted to Christianity. And he actually wrote one of the actually reasons we know for sure that Mani is like a historical figure is because he wrote a polemic against the Manichaeism Church, where he went through one of their sort of key spiritual texts and he tried writing a refutation of it. in a way where he could break down the theological content and compare it to sort of mainline Christianity that he had converted to and elucidate its sort of falsity from his perspective at that time in life. It's a super interesting religion because it is essentially, in my mind, especially after doing more research for this episode, is kind of the apotheosis of Gnosticism. Gnosticism, without going on another tangent, is effectively like a series of different religious beliefs and texts, some of which are related and interlinked with one another, some of which are not, that all try broadly, I'm going to be general here, to make a syncretism of world religions to create a pursuit of knowledge, is I guess the way that I would generally put it. They believed that knowledge was sort of the great divine kind of animating force or anima in the world, and pursuit of that knowledge would, by necessity, lead to a separation from the world itself that would make you closer to godliness. And they latched onto a lot of religious ideas that existed within a lot of different world religions. And Monarchism is essentially the most complete work of Gnosticism that you can really point to in terms of an actual like unified syncretic theory of a lot of these different world religions and traditions towards a stated end goal. Mani, the leader of the belief system, was actually raised Jewish and Christian, but he became a Gnostic and began writing the fundamental texts of it after a visit to India, where he studied both Hinduism and Buddhism. The attempt of the religion was to essentially create, as I've mentioned, one unified theory of belief that would surpass the partial truths of world religions while integrating them together. In a lot of ways, he tried merging, in particular, the following list of things: Mesopotamian and Babylonian traditions, Greek traditions, Greco-Roman mysteries, Platonism, Iranian traditions prior to Islam, Zoroastrianism, Hellenism, Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Christianity. Most people within the church viewed Mani as the final prophet in a series of prophets that included the Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus. Its focus was on active proselytizing, and that allowed it to spread really far. It's also one of the best examples we have of like actual Gnostic temples and churches and enclaves that we have found like actual structures and ruins of. So there's a good footprint that this religion left on the world as well. It was a dualist theology that taught the belief in a war between darkness and light, one in which light is gradually seeping out of the material world and going back into heaven, the realm of God and knowledge and all of the good things. That's where light itself comes from. And as that seeps out, it leaves behind an evil, materialistic world in its wake. The religion was very, very well developed in its theology, which is somewhat the opposite of a lot of other Gnostic belief systems, where they would write these texts, they would write parables, they would write stories, they would create other gospels or testaments of Jesus. But we don't get a sense that there was like a well-honed, well-developed set of scriptures and instructions for the believers of that religion. This was not the case with Monarchism. It was very, very well developed, and it was actually well adhered to, regardless of the spread that it has. We don't have any sort of reason to believe, based on the historical information we have and the different ruins that have been accessed and discovered, that there was different sects of it or different interpretations of the scriptures. It does not have the same problem, or it did not have the same problem that modern day Christianity has, where essentially at this point you can say anything is in the Bible and you'll be able to find 25 people who want to donate 10% of their paycheck to you to keep your church running. Everything was pretty much well put together and well seen after in the church, no matter how large the actual spread of it got to. There are also numerous overlaps between it and Against the Day. If we get into the like theological aspect of the church and the belief system, we find that these overlaps become especially relevant within these two chapters in particular. But here's just a few of them. The father of greatness creates something called the world of light, and he has 4 faces or 4 aspects. Those 4 faces or 4 aspects are divinity, light, power, and wisdom. He has 5 Shekinahs, which is a Hebrew term that essentially means embodiment. It's a feminine term for the feminine aspect of Hashem if you're talking about the actual like sort of Jewish tradition. But when you get down to the root point of the word, it refers to these different kind of embodied characteristics where you can become in touch with the deity or the father of greatness in the case of monotheism through these different aspects. And those are reason, intelligence, the mind, and thought. They also have a creation myth that has a couple different steps to it. In the first creation, there was the divine coupling of the mother of life and the first man, which led to what they call the first understanding. And from the first understanding, there were 5 sons. And those 5 sons were the ether, wind, light, water, and fire, who coupled to create the 6th son, which is wisdom. And then from wisdom is the anima mundi, or the living self. And then from there, the realm of light is hoisted in another creation myth above the realm of darkness, and the divine Jesus attempts to awaken humanity to the light within their fallen bodies. But the realm of darkness is always eating away, building and expanding, and keeping humanity imprisoned. They believed this was an ongoing war and process in human history by which light is removed from the human world and gradually returned to the realm of the divine. It's clear that Pynchon has some belief in this, at least rhetorically for the book, and even more so than Against the Day, but just in his writing project. Because I would say that especially with the Hollow Earth stuff, with all of the stuff to do with light in these chapters and to do with the thing that we have kind of, or at least I have been kind of developing as we've done this show, is this idea of the writing project as something that depicts this death of magic, death of light, and death of sort of Eden as we move into the 20th century. And so as that death of mystery and divinity in the wake of the 20th century comes about, Pynchon kind of has been mining that for most of his career. These things have never been more prevalent, especially at this phase of Against the Day with these 2 chapters. However, it's not that simple. It's not all good. It's a religion, so there's still going to be problems with it. The Monarchians believe that the way towards glory was paved with a removal from the world, just like a lot of other Gnostic sects. Members who were committed were called perfects, and those who were in the church but not committed were called hearers. It was their job to help the perfects. This essentially creates another system of elect and preterite that is ripe for exploitation. Yeah, so that's your kind of rundown on monarchism. It is very obvious to me why it is that Pynchon chose this religion or tradition for Against the Day, and in particular for this set of chapters. That's everything I got for you. Anything else you guys want to add on this particular aspect of the chapters?
I firstly just thank you, because that was a lot of really important and relevant information that I was not too familiar with. And I think you're absolutely right in highlighting it, because it is clearly a pivotal part of this, not just the story, but I think, like you said, Pynchon's entire bibliography. It is a fascinating religion, and it's one that definitely, is not a common one that comes up in discussion, but it's a fascinating one to have an understanding of, and it's one that I'm probably going to end up going and trying to just kind of learn more about. That being said, I do love that after all of that, like that discussion that is happening, and the kind of explanation, a more compact explanation than what you just gave. So obviously not as in depth, but still it's implied that the characters kind of have this kind of background knowledge because they're characters in the book. They have to. But the fact that the way that that Darby reacts to it, that's the choice. Lighter pussy. What kind of choice is that? Suckling. Sorry, Lindsay. I meant vagina, of course. Like just it's those little like I love those kind of things after such a big info drop, so to speak, even though this isn't really a big one. There's just a lot of it hidden in the text that takes a lot of research to get out. But that's just the nature of these boys. Like they're just boys, you know? And that's the way they process this information is they hear all of this and that's all they can think about.
Okay, yeah, just to kind of build off what Cody was saying about not hearing about Manichaeism very much. I can think of only 2 discussions I've seen of it, or like stuff I've seen about it. I mean, I've seen stuff about it as it relates to Gnosticism, like Kate pointed out, but I think Manichaeism was something that Philip K. Dick was very interested in. And I do think that Pynchon, it's possible that Pynchon is a Philip K. Dick fan, because Philip K. Dick's exegesis would have addressed a lot of the type of ideas that Gnosticism played with, and that Kate was kind of just explaining to us. And then the other context I've seen discussion of Manichaeism is for the TV show Raised by Wolves, I want to say, with like the fictional religions they create in that book or in that show seem to have something to do with Manichaeism. Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much else to add other than I do find Manichaeism pretty interesting as a religion. And that's a very interesting like theology.
Yeah, there's two other major points in like Pynchonian, what one might assume Pynchon read. In the case of the recognitions, Manichaeism is kind of a looming specter over the main characters in a way that I can't explain right now. But it's there, and it's like there are like 10 pages in the middle of that book that is just Manichaean screed, which is cool. And the other one is going to be Moby Dick, where I can't remember he has a name, but unfortunately it's used like twice. There's a Persian character who kind of comes out of nowhere and turns out to have been Captain Ahab's spiritual counselor throughout the journey, essentially. And he's described as a Manichaean, I think. But I think just 2 bits of like historical context surrounding Manichaeism that I think are easily overlooked, especially when you look at it as just another Gnostic sect, even if it's just the most successful Gnostic sect that we actually have like writings from. A couple of major things is that as much as Manichaeism and Mandaeism and all the other Gnostic sects that we have anything written about might imply, like Christianity, if you're taking a secular point of view on it, was formed of a similar kind of syncretism. It's just that it was a slightly more insular one. It was, the Babylonian / Semitic / Arab religious beliefs coming together in contact with kind of the apotheosis of what's called Greek rationalism, in the form of people like Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus and other people from that in that period that were kind of contemporaneous with the Buddha, just separated by like a few thousand miles. And so there's an interesting way of looking at Manichaeism as essentially one side of that syncretism, or really Gnosticism as a broad trend, coming up out of those same currents, but being less successful for reasons regarding, minority cultures in empire, because the Hellenic period was empires throughout, Persia and modern day Iraq and the Levant and all of that area. But there's an argument that they are like 2 sibling movements, essentially, that have little to no distinction, except that one of them has a continuous historical like footprint in the form of the Orthodox and a Catholic Church and the Syriac Church and all of those different organizations. Reason I'm bringing that up is that one of the reasons that historians will say, in the way that historians, attribute causation to Manichaeism's kind of decline, because no one believes it these days, as far as I'm aware. Well, obviously there are some people, but realistically, it's not a living religion. Is that it was so much a kind of proto-Islam that when Islam came around and it brought together the same strength of theology with the force of an ethno-religion, that those compounding dynamics of like majority control in the context of the Catholic churches and etc. Kind of got subverted, because now you have the Arab equivalent. And anyway, as a result, you can kind of look at the obsession with Manichaeism in the 19th century as this weird kind of like ultra-Orientalism, where they're looking at the same kinds of things that they believe and the same kinds of things that that this huge mass of people in the form of Muslims believe, but they're not willing to dignify actual Muslims with talking to them. And so they get focused academically on this kind of pre-Islam. And I apologize in advance if any of our listeners are big time Muslims. I mean, no offense. Like, I said the same thing about Christianity, said the same thing about Manichaeism. Not playing sides here. I think they all got a decent shot at being as true as any of the others. So please don't come for us. But yeah, I think that's important to know.
All really, really great stuff. Thank you, Will.
Of course.
So that brings us to Nouveau Rialto, which is one of these places underneath the sand that they have found in the past and that are still habitated. It is a, quote, Manichaean city, which dated from the 3rd century and according to tradition had been founded by Mani himself in his wanderings beyond the farther banks of the Oxus. There it remained and flourished for nearly 1,000 years until Genghis Khan and his armies overran that part of Inner Asia, leaving as little as they could, either standing or breathing. By the time the Venetians found it, little remained that had not succumbed to wind, gravity, and an excruciating departure of faith. In the brief time they occupied Nouveau Rialto, the Westerners managed to put in a network of cisterns to collect what rainwater came that way, run some pipe, even sink a few wells. Inexplicably, as if attending to ancient voices somehow preserved in the crystallography of the silica medium which was so mercilessly engulfing the town, as if secret knowledge had once been written that permanently into its very substance, they began to fall year by year under the influence of the old para-Christian doctrines. The first undersand explorers here had identified Manichaean shrines dating from no earlier than the 14th century, clearly 1,000 years more recent than they ought to have been. Here's the interesting thing. Nouveau Rialto is a named in the same way that you might have like a New Berlin or a New York or a New England or whatever. Rialto, though, is a center of commerce that is associated with Venice. And so you have here another case of this merging of spirituality and commerce coming up in this book, and how that is inherently perverted in some way, going all the way back to the beginning of the book. And I mean like literal beginning in the first page, where that stamp that is on the flyleaf is best sort of translated to the Chamber of Commerce of Shambhala. And so you have one of these spiritual cities founded by someone who is going around kind of creating doctrine that is now being named after a center of commerce in the Western world, specifically one of these great powers, the Kingdom of Italy at this time. So really important context there, I would say. What do we make of the fact that the city is about 1,000 years newer in its relics than it should be for the time that the religion came from?
I'm not really. Oh, go ahead, Will.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've got a really specific thing. I'm trying to remember the exact name for it. So if you've got things to say, go for it.
I was gonna say I don't really have an answer to that. The Penchon Wiki is linking it to, what is it? It says That is, the Manichaean shrines date from the 14th century, when the 4th century, not the 4th century, when the Mani, the founder, started Manichaeism. Pinch on dating, quote, when it went bad in history. So I don't know about that. That seems like a bit of a stretch, but I don't know. I have nothing particular about that, other than I do think it's important that the Chums mention, they specifically state, as above, so below, ain't it? Like this is that sort of inversion of things. They've seen this before, above land, from the sky, and now they're coming at it the same basic principle, coming at it from below in the same set of circumstances.
I mean, if you want to get real conspiratorial with it too, as above, so below is like a satanic
Yeah,
phrase.
yeah. There's a lot of ways to take it different context with this, but yeah.
So there's this. I think you could call it a conspiracy theory. I think you have to call it a conspiracy theory. It's much weirder than most conspiracy theories. It's called phantom time and like this new chronology idea, which is
Hell yeah, phantom time sounds awesome.
It does. Dude.
The idea is that basically the Catholic Church manufactured the last 1,000 years of Roman history.
Okay.
Holy shit. Okay.
It's one of those things that to even start to explain it, you have to dig so deeply into the psyches of the people who do it that it feels crazy. And it's not a good theory. It's not something that it's not like, a lot of the stuff we've been talking about where reasonable people thought, yeah, maybe the Aryan supernation did start humanity, which obviously, but at the moment people thought that. And this is a real contemporary theory that people believe now and are trying to get published and pick up steam. And there's a Chinese and Russian kind of not government driven, but cultural driven kind of attempt to establish a broader idea that the Western history is entirely false. And it's anyway, point is, I think that in 2006, it's pretty likely that Pynchon would have come across the new chronology folks, because that's when they had a little bit of traction online. And those folks definitely believed that there just wasn't time that happened. Their excuse for basically the fact that there was no technological progress that they dignify. And anyway, it's kind of just a weird inversion of that, where you have the Manichaeans as this very esoteric group, literally hidden from sight under this desert. Some of them still living, but they have 1,000 years missing instead of extra.
I'm good with that. Let's change it. Quick shout out to the guy on the Pynchon wiki who felt the need to tell us he visited Coney Island in the 50s.
Yeah.
I have no clue why the wiki for this book is so fucking crazy.
It is.
Every time something like this happens, I just chuckle.
I had forgotten about how unhinged it gets until I hit that part. It's just kind of going through, finding things. That kind of makes sense. Wait, why? Why does that matter? Why? Who cares? Good for you, dude, I guess.
So the crew disembarks for some shore leave. Feels inaccurate. I don't know how to describe what kind of leave this is. And they go out into the city, and they learn that there are gigantic sand fleas that bite people, but that there is also a very vibrant culture, and you can go to a saloon underneath the sand, which is exactly what several of them do. And they meet a couple of oil prospectors. And this is where this chapter really takes a turn that I don't think I was expecting it to take, where suddenly it becomes about oil speculation and kind of resource pillaging. I mean, it's fitting for what the Western powers are up to at the time, and why they might invest in something like this, but it was a very okay, we're doing this now. And before I ask you guys about your impression of this, these two people refer to two specific places. They refer to Spindletop, and they refer to Grozny. Grozny was the center of the Russian oil industry in Chechnya for a really long time. That oil field is apparently pretty much tapped now. They're not actively drilling on it anymore. Spindletop, however, is a much bigger deal. I did not know this, but apparently the petroleum age as a fuel source for like transportation and essentially anything other than lubrication and like lamps began with this discovery at Spindletop. Prior to the Spindletop gusher in Texas, evidently petroleum for using any other way besides those two of lighting and lubrication would have just been too expensive because they thought it was too finite of a resource. But with Spindletop, it was an oil well in Texas that came in on January 10th, 1901. It gushed oil for 9 days at an estimated rate of 100,000 barrels a day. By June, there were 13 gushers all in the same field that had been discovered. And overnight, the U.S. had become the world's leading oil producer, backed by the Texas oil boom that began with Spindletop. In fact, if it had not been for this discovery, the burning of petroleum would not have been economically feasible for a fuel source. Prior to the Texas boom, it was only being used in limited capacity. So this one discovery pushed us into the petroleum age. So if you want to know why it is that we have to deal with, smog and the pollution from fossil fuels that we have to deal with now, someone can go back and shoot some prospector in the head in Texas in 1901 and try and keep that from ever happening.
Yeah, I was fascinated by that as well.
Yeah.
Really interesting bit of not even that far removed history too.
No. And it turns out that these prospectors are basically spending some time in the city to gather funds to go open up their own well, essentially, to make their fortune in oil. And they essentially warn the Chums that the people they're working with may not have the spiritual inclinations that they are assuming they do for this pursuit, and that instead they may just be here looking for oil as well for their home nation. So I'm sure we have thoughts on this sort of tableau and the implications of such. What do you guys think?
I mean, it's certainly something that's been hinted at throughout the book, right? That the organization that is behind the Chums and their chapters are sinister in nature at best, world destroying at worst, maybe. It also does this does hammer home again the fact that the Chums are still boys, because there's this line on 441 after these prospectors tell them about, if you go look down in your ship, you're probably gonna find some oil drilling tools. Darby found this amusing. One more bit of proving how little adults could be trusted. So again, they are older and they are physically older, but they are still mentally kind of unable to process this kind of information without kind of looking at it through the lens of a teenager. Really, if being generous, maybe, but I think this naivety is a big part of why they are still doing what they're doing. Like there have been times obviously where they have questioned what's going on, but they have this steadfast allegiance that has kept them from really understanding the sort of machinations that are behind what it is they're doing, even when they're kind of almost explicitly told by someone like, guys, this isn't like, this company ain't doing what you think they're doing. Like they're selling you one thing and they're doing something else behind your back, and they just can't wrap their heads around it.
I do want to point out that as a resident of the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah, Dallas and Fort Worth, that two oil prospectors finding inspiration for where to mine oil in the Bible is like the most Dallas thing I've probably ever heard of, and a very Texan thing as well.
Yeah.
So I did like that reference to Spindletop.
Yeah,
And I mean, let's be fair. I do think that if there's a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah in Texas, it's probably more likely to be San Antonio and Austin.
Oh,
most Odessa.
Midland, Odessa. Actually, that's a good one too.
It's
in the desert. I have nothing to add on. I just think y'all did a great job of explaining all of that stuff.
Oh yeah, as Cody mentions, they go back to the ship and they do some investigating. Here was one part where I did laugh. I forgot about this, where they decide when they get to the Oasis Marco Chierney which I'm assuming is how that's pronounced, he is a historical figure that was part of the conspiracy against the Doge of Venice, which we talked about a long time ago. A very, very long time ago when the Chums were in Venice. You can go revisit that one if you want to know more about that. Darby has advised them to potentially see if they can find a way to blow open the safe to see if they can get a look at the kind of oil prospecting records, or to find proof that they are not actually looking for Shambhala, and then instead they're here doing some sort of other sinister errand. And this exchange is very funny. As legal officer, Darby said, "I'm not sure how much loyalty we owe them, especially when they're keeping so much from us. Myself, I'd favor the Peterman option. Ain't the safe built counterfly can't blow. See him." Thus, although he was not, as later alleged, actually planning to steal or even unauthorizedly scrutinize the documents, it was an awkward moment when Q-Zane Toadflax entered his cabin one midwatch to find Randolph gazing at the safe with a number of dynamite sticks and detonators on his person. From then until the boys' departure, there were masters at arms posted outside Toadflax's cabin around the clock. When at last they surfaced near the compound where the inconvenience was moored, their farewells were notable for their economy.
Yeah, I had that underlined too because that one was pretty hilarious too. And then the fact that they when they do get back to their ship, they find that pretty much everything has been taken off the ship. The Gurkhas have all gone, and Pugnax is basically drunk and food drunk at the same time, and just kind of like, "Where the hell have you guys been? I've been by here by myself this entire time, drinking expensive wine and eating the fanciest foods we had on here."
I think an important detail that I meant to mention earlier is just that Gurkhas at this point in time, and I think to this day, although it's professional militaries do professional military things, the British Gurkhas were the equivalent to the French Foreign Legion in that they would take basically anyone who signed up if they were skilled enough at fighting and fell into regiment. So they are totally the kind of force that like you would not necessarily hire out technically, but essentially hire out and then like have do your dirty work, and then you just deal with a massive mess afterward. Is kind of what the Gurkhas do and did.
I didn't know that. That's a good addition.
Yeah, it's one of those things where like the history is a lot more romantic than what it is in reality.
Yeah.
Or it's sure they're very talented fighters if you think that kind of thing is impressive. And there is like a history of like specifically, Nepalese fighters who formed the original Gurkhas. But yeah, it's a much messier kind of regiment than any other sort of military force.
So thus, we've reached the end of their undersand adventure, and the inconvenience soars up and away, and we get this great quote. Does somebody want to read on 443 the quote starting with "whatever is to happen" through to the end of the paragraph with the ellipses?
Yeah, I've got it right here. "Whatever is to happen," he reported upon his return, "will begin out here with an engagement of cavalry on a scale no one living has ever seen, and perhaps no one dead either. An inundation of horse spanning these horizons, their flanks struck an unearthly green, storm-lit, relentless, unwinding, arisen, boiling from the very substance of desert and steppe. And all that incarnation and slaughter will transpire in silence all across this great planetary killing floor, absorbing wind, steel, hooves upon and against earth, massed clamor of horses, cries of men. Millions of souls will arrive and depart. Perhaps news of it will take years to reach anyone who might understand what it meant."
And I think that that's like a key thing, because obviously sort of the specter of World War I looms very large over this book, especially after the time travel experience that two of the Chums experienced just a little bit ago. But I think really like this book as a project over the course of these two chapters in particular, as sort of we've all mentioned how it's more developing thematically than doing more setup or more explanation, that it's really explaining the kind of death of the 19th century in a lot of different ways, and how that is leading to the rise of something much darker and something much more secularly evil, without that religious magic, without that Gnosticism, that search for knowledge, without the underlying desire for money and influence. That World War I kind of represents the as I believe I've said at some other point, the apotheosis of that really, from the point of World War One, you reach this kind of point of no return where all of these things are connected, they're vertically integrated like the Golden Fang, and they're ready to, control everything going forward. That is going to take on more relevance in the next chapter when we get to it, but it's important, I think, that the Chums are beginning to see that happen essentially,
Yeah.
and then it's being articulated to the reader. We learn that the Soxal has come to grief, that after leaving the Chums, they got into some kind of underground fight or war that is happening in Asia over these different oil prospecting spots. There's a reference here to Standard Oil and the Nobel brothers as being potentially behind the attack. The Nobel brothers are the other two members of the trilogy of brothers, one of whom invented dynamite and the Nobel Prize is named after, and the other two of who became oilmen. And were such successful oilmen that when the communist revolution happened in Russia in the October Revolution, they nationalized the Nobel Brothers Oil Company. And just another sort of random piece of history that again shows how these things are all related, because Alfred Nobel was also made part owner of the Nobel Brothers Oil Company. He had, I believe, 8.9% worth of the stock share in the company.
Oh, wow.
So again, these different alliances between science and industry and oil and all of these things are. I keep going back to the Golden Fang. It's all vertically integrated. This book is all about vertical integration.
To jump back real quick from right there, the invisible attackers who appear to be using a frequency shifting device or some power and sophistication, able to mask an entire undersand fighting vessel from all known viewing equipment. Did anyone else get Philadelphia Experiment vibes from that?
I got that there was the intruders who kept messing around with
okay.
going back in time to stop the global crisis.
That would make sense too. Yeah, I started thinking about Philadelphia Experiment just because of the bilocation aspect of it, because that was I think a big part of that was that they didn't just disappear the ship, it also went somewhere else for a little bit and then came back. I could be wrong on that. I know they made a ship invisible supposedly, but I think there was a part of that also that they got sent somewhere down coast.
Yeah.
That's a Montauk thing, isn't it?
No, Montauk Experiment was different. Philadelphia Experiment, it's a older conspiracy theory that the post World War II Navy was working on some kind of cloaking device, and according to one person who witnessed it, who's roundly been debunked since, they made the ship invisible for a period of time, and then it traveled somewhere else with people on it, and then came back and had, depending on which iteration of the story he's telling, it had different impacts on them. I know in one telling of it, they were frozen in time, and in another one, they were all dead or something. So it's just a weird little piece of history, but that's kind of the first place my mind went to when I thought about invisible ships and bilocations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong at all there. I think if I remember correctly, there's also some of the, again, none of the stuff about the Philadelphia Experiment is reliable, documented.
Yeah.
But some of the even more questionable stuff, I think, resembles superficially a lot of the visions of World War One that the Chums are bearing witness to. There's one account I vaguely remember that they when they turned it on, they experienced a few hours of just weird hellish horror that they couldn't really make sense of, and then they just were somewhere else.
That sounds about right too.
Yeah. And I think it's there. I also think that it is obvious, in the way that they talk about in the technobabble way, the way that they're using light and they're using polarization. It's very much like radar jamming, which I think is the simplest way to talk about it.
Yeah.
And this is where we kind of see another outbreak of these strange wars, very, very long ago in the book. The kind of different battles that were taking place between airships in the sky and these sort of strange attacks that were happening. But now it's happening underneath the sand. Here on 444, it says, meanwhile, for days, weeks in some places, The battles of the Taklamakan War were raging. The earth trembled. Now and then a sub-desertine craft would suddenly break the surface with no warning, damaged mortally, its crew dead or dying. Petroleum deposits far underground were attacked. Lakes of this stuff would appear overnight, and great pillars of fire would ascend to the sky. From Kashgar to Urumqi, the bazaars were full of weapons, breathing units, ship fittings, hardware nobody could identify, full of strange gauges and prisms and electrical wiring, which later proved to be from Quaternion ray weapons, which all the powers had deployed. These now fell into the hands of goat herders, falconers, shamans, to be taken out into the emptiness, disassembled, studied, converted to uses religious and practical, and eventually to change the history of the world island beyond even the most unsound projections of those powers who imagine themselves somehow at this late date still competing for it. I read that quote for a couple of reasons. One, the description, if I recall correctly, is very, very similar to the description of the kind of war in the sky that was happening way earlier in the book, at least the first part of it anyway. So if we're looking at this from a bilocations perspective and in comparing this with earlier portions of the book, then there's certainly some room for interpretation there. But I think the other thing that Luke touched on in his thoughts on these chapters is a lot of what is described here is also sort of the Gulf War, where they lit the oil wells on fire in the Gulf War to kind of try and stop the advance of the U.S. military in that, but then also kind of resembles what happened with the Mujahideen, where we armed a bunch of sort of individual freedom fighters or, just people who were merchants or farmers or herders, and then those mujahideen eventually became the different terrorist networks that committed 9/11, and then that of course wreaked havoc on Central Asia in an act of retaliation by the US. So in terms of that original Pynchon description of the book of no similarity to current events is intended, it feels like this is very much an intentional commentary on some of the stuff that happened in the Gulf, and then of course, would happen a little bit after the book was published as well.
Yeah, the end of the paragraph you just talked about is the main thing I was thinking in terms of relevance to the early to mid 2000s, like around when this book was published, because maybe not everyone knows like all the details, but is the movie Charlie Wilson's War? Is that the one?
Yeah,
where it's about us? Yeah. Because not everyone knows this stuff. So like I went to go see that movie with some friends. I think when it came out, I think I was in high school, and they were conservative, my friends, and we were talking afterwards. And I was like, do you support what Charlie Wilson did? Do you support me, like us arming the like militias and stuff in Afghanistan to fight against the Russians? Everybody was like, yeah, blah blah blah. It's such a good idea. It's such a cool movie. And I was like, you do know that like. And I don't mean to be too dramatic about this, I guess, but and his dad had been in the military and stuff. And I was like, you do know that like those exact weapons are being like used to shoot at American soldiers right now, like literally as we're talking. He's like, blah 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 blah. But people don't know all this, that like the weapons used against us in Afghanistan, a lot of them were provided by us like 10, 20 years beforehand.
Yep.
And Lord knows that might happen again, because whenever we pulled out of Afghanistan the last time, we left a bunch of military equipment that we didn't even sabotage. We just like left it there. Which I found that very interesting. I did want to kind of go back a little bit, which y'all did cover this, and it's basically implied, but the Chums of Chance being kind of warned that the presence in the area may be more related to oil prospecting, and they're not actually there to find Shambhala. Probably they're there to like kind of observe what's going on and perhaps find oil or other resources. And people, I'm sure there's at least this had to have happened at least once in the early to mid 2000s, where somebody was talking about how they wanted to join the military and go over to Afghanistan or Iraq and punish them for 9/11 and blah blah blah. And I'm sure somebody at some point told somebody, like, you do realize that those wars are just happening because of oil. Like, you would just be going over there just to basically fight over a natural resource. And some of that frustration, I think that Pynchon probably felt. I'm sure Pynchon, I kind of forget exactly when the WMD scandal broke, that there weren't WMDs, that whole thing was fabricated. But I have to imagine that some of Pynchon's anti-war and anti-war sentiment and his ability to kind of weirdly see through the lines and stuff. I'm sure he was pretty frustrated by a lot of U.S. foreign policy around when the final touches of this on this book were being done.
Oh, I would imagine so, for sure.
Yeah. And if you're interested in sort of more history about what Luke just talked about in terms of Charlie Wilson and Afghanistan and the Mujahideen fighters, there's a YouTube channel called Burn These Books that I would highly recommend, who did like a 3-part series on Charlie Wilson and the like American adventure in Afghanistan prior to 2001, that I would highly recommend, that really, really digs into the history behind what we did there and why, and how it is not as simple as that movie portrays, but then also, of course, like the American propaganda after 9/11 portrays as well.
So I wanted to take a moment to focus in on the Quaternion rays of it all.
I figured you would.
Yeah, because this is one of those things that people treat as extremely obscure, and it is obscure. None of what I'm going to say theoretically is like anything I'm confident in, but I think it's, again, keep in mind the context, right? Keep in mind 2003 through 2005, the way that the propaganda was starting to break down, and the way that the lies that the mainstream media that were complicit in manufacturing consent for the Iraq and Afghanistan wars were tying themselves into knots to appear not like what they were, I guess. Because one thing you got to remember about Quaternions is that when it comes to why anyone still uses them today in mathematics, is that it makes rotations easy. If you're doing things in vector mathematics, you have to model a whole lot more than you do with Quaternions when you're rotating an object or force in 3 dimensions. With Quaternions, you just multiply it by a certain matrix of positive and negative 1. With vectors, it depends entirely on all of the specifics, how you exactly go about it. It's spinning. It's spinning history. It's talking about how at this point in time, all of these world powers had Quaternion ray beams. They were able to focus on history and rotate things, make certain parts oblique, make certain parts more obvious, and make it look like the version of the story they wanted to be true was obviously the case. And it just so happened that these random goat herders, falconers, and shamans got a hold of them and started doing the same thing. And on one level, yeah, absolutely, there's a direct comparison to the funding of the Taliban and the Mujahideen. There's also, it's a real analogy to kind of like post-modernity as a phenomenon, if you'll suffer me for that, where basically if you choose to take kind of the simple line of postmodernism is the refusal to allow grand narratives to dominate the model of the world, per se, then what this is describing the intellectual process of Western governments looking at history and picking and choosing what to teach their people, what to highlight in the news, what to incentivize people to care about, and seeing the way that led in those exact same tools were used in the Middle East and led directly to the formations of what we now call Islamism, the politically extreme, religiously fundamentalist form of Islam that most people these days, at least in the Western world, take to be like the true form of Islam. When no, it came out of these same dynamics that led to American Christian fundamentalism. It came out of the same dynamics that led to sedevacantism in the Roman Catholic Church. It's the same dynamics, just functioning on the level of kind of like metaphysics in this case, where they're just kind of rotating the world around instead of just rotating the facts.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I am going to touch on that in the next chapter a lot.
Very good.
So that explains a lot of, you did a lot of table setting for me. So thank you.
You're welcome.
It's very important information to have. And I think the Quaternion stuff is something that a lot of people, myself included, still struggle with when reading this book, because it's advanced physics for the most part.
It's just not something you deal with as a normal person.
No, if you're
Thank
a
God.
physicist or an astrophysicist or something, yes, you're going to deal with that. But the layperson, we just don't. And so it can be a difficult thing to wrap your head on. But I think having that kind of base knowledge, like you were just explaining, with it's specifically with its relation to rotation, is crucial to understanding what's going on in the second half of the book.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, like, think about how Kit talks about Quaternions. This is how they are thought of today, roughly. That Quaternions were like a halfway point between traditional complex numbers and true n-dimensional vector analysis. And in effect, all things you can do with Quaternions, you can do with vectors. It just requires a complete mastery of mathematics, essentially, to do it. The Quaternions let you take a massive degree of shortcuts at the expense of only being able to take into account 3 dimensions and have the 4th dimension assumed to be time. So the only place it's actually really used for these days is like in programming. Like it can be used in astrophysics, but that's like when you're writing code on the engine, right? Anyway, the point is, all of that's there. And also it's T.E. Lawrence. It's Lawrence of Arabia. It is also this this Westerner who came from the seat of empire and fell in love with the Middle East, fell in love with Syria, fell in love with the people, the Arab people, and the religion of Islam, and spent the next like 10, 15 years trying to make their lives better in the same way that Narrance tried to make soldiers' lives better. And in effect, what he ended up doing was destroying the Ottoman Empire and helping to create the political and like material conditions for the rise of Islamism and the absolute monstrosities that form of belief has led to. And it's just kind of all in there because why not? Thanks, Pynchon.
It's the history of the modern civilization and its world.
Yeah, and I just want to, just so it's clear, the connection there to T.E. Lawrence is not just symbolically. He's the guy who figured out how to wage war by loosening bolts. And there's a lot about reconstructing and deconstructing physical things. Anyway.
So there is one survivor of the Saxhall, and that is our friend Stilton Gaspereau, the stinky cheese man himself. And he makes his way back to England to speak with Inspector something or other.
Not Gadget.
Sands, which Inspector Sands is like a colloquial term of emergency in England, where you can like call for Inspector Sands, and that is meant to indicate that there is an emergency of some kind, but not to alarm sort of the general public. In this book, though, Inspector Sands is a real guy who Stilton Gaspereau goes to speak with about what is happening beneath the sand. And to do so, this was so random. To get in contact with him without sort of like arousing suspicion, he pretends to be the gentleman bomber of the cricket matches that is referenced fucking 200 pages ago is when that gets introduced, when he first comes to England, the cyclomite user whose name is escaping me right now.
Liu.
Yeah, correct. So he disguises himself as that, and then when Inspector Sands picks him up, he sort of reveals who he really is, and that he's here to kind of give him a message. And the message he's giving him is that there is something desperately going wrong in the sands, and that people are fighting a war over the oil. Here on page 448, it says, "We are not the only ones there, Sands. At this moment, all the powers present in the region are bringing in their forces. Frigate actions like the Soxals are the only opening feints. Chances increase day by day for some sort of sustained conflict over possession of the city in regimental strength, if not larger. But I have constant telephonic connection with Whitehall. Why hasn't anyone ever mentioned this? Oh, because I'm mad, I suppose, and it's been all no more than a madman's fantasy. That's just it, my boy. By now I know that your most deranged utterances are only conventional history prematurely blurted. He produced a half-sovereign case in the shape of Mr. Campbell Bannerman's head. Need to find a telephone box, I suppose. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Off he went. The dim, blessed local, which when crossing the desert Gaspereau had quite given up on ever seeing again, slowly, sympathetically drew him into its cherished inability to imagine anything clearly beyond Dover. What do we think on this sort of closing phase of the chapter with Stilton escaping and warning the inspector of what's going on with Shambhala, the sort of war over the I guess you could say from a literary device perspective, war over spiritualism.
So this is one of those things that I thought was hilarious because there is the entire beginning of this, like his having to dress up for his place, and then his entire like interaction with Inspector Sands is funny as hell. But there is a joke that's nestled in here. If you remember at the beginning of the show, I said I wrote a note that literally just says, "Come on." Mm-hmm. So he's described on page 445 in the shiny green suit and sort of gondolier's hat, except for that, well, it's not a ribbon, is it? More of a feather, almost a plume, really. Rather extreme, wouldn't you say? Could be Italian, I suppose. Page 446. After they run into each other. There, Luigi. He set up a fucking Mario joke. A page before.
Yep.
Did nobody else catch that?
No, I did not.
Wash over me, you know?
Yeah, I saw that, and that's my note on there is just, come on. So there's that. But then the whole thing of just like him, the way they interact with each other and like, oh yeah, I got you now. I understand. Fake arrest you. Wink, wink. And then, making sure that he's handcuffed loosely enough that he can still make, I don't remember how the hand gesticulations, the cuffs did not noticeably interfere with his ethnic gesticulations. It's just a funny scene. I thought, until you get to the end and there actually gets to be that kind of thematical weight to it. But the beginning of it is pretty funny.
So just as a note, Kate, actually about like 270 pages back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you checking that.
Yeah, no, I really like this section as, there's comedy, but it's almost like a very goofy but very cynically goofy version of the web traverse and Merle write out, code talk, I guess, scene. Mm-hmm. Where they're clearly trying to like speak, pointy angles at each other, and they're just not succeeding. They're just kind of talking at each other. And I don't know. It is interesting because you can sit there and you can try and like read between the lines and figure out what each of them are saying, but they don't really line up. They clearly are not on the same page, and it's funny how deeply that's true.
I do love every time in Pynchon's fiction that it's pneumatic tubes, right? Come up.
Yeah.
They come up in Shadow Ticket, and I believe they've already come up in this book. I could be wrong.
I think they came up earlier, yeah.
France, I think, yeah.
It just strikes me as a very Pynchonian thing to include, and it always reminds me of the film Brazil, which is
yes,
is maybe not directly Pynchonian, but has some Pynchonian aspects. Yeah.
Well, apparently just like a real thing too. Because of course I did. About 4.5 million telegrams were sent using the system a day. London used to use the pneumatic tubes as transit stations between sorting offices. So they would have dozens of these sorting offices where they would send the tubes between, and then you would have local dispatchers bring out the telegrams to people. Because apparently between that and there's a system for that in France too. And then, yeah, it was in Shadow Ticket. It must have just been a pretty common way to do. I wish we still had to do that. I would love to send messages via pneumatic tube.
Yeah,
I mean, I've done it in like pharmacy drive-throughs. I feel like.
Oh yeah, banks do it too. Yeah,
banks.
There's another layer of Pynchonianism to it, which I don't think meaningful, but I think it's there. And that I think it's in some Scandinavian nation or town, really. They use pneumatic tubes for their waste management, or at least they did, like back in the mid-century period. And that's just super pensiony to have literal mode of transportation or not mode of transportation for physical objects, but communication that is also just waste management. That's pretty pensiony.
Yeah, definitely.
That does bring us to the end of this chapter. Is there anything else that anyone had to add before we move on to chapter 19?
Yeah, I did. I think this has come up. I think Cody has brought this up, but the whole traveling on through the sand in a submarine, like a vehicle is some type of vehicle is probably one of the most memorable parts of this book, I would say, just in terms of how original it is and how much it stuck with me a lot. I remember I was talking about I had read Against the Day, and I was talking to somebody who has read some Pynchon but hadn't read Against the Day, and they were asking me what are some of the crazier parts. I meant that's to me is one of the crazier, one of the more memorable parts of this book in retrospect is the Chums of Chance traveling through sand underground. It's very well done too, but it's just really cool.
Yeah, I do love it, and I still hold on to the idea that the inspiration from that came from Final Fantasy VI, because I just think that would make a little bit of sense, because that's the only other place I have ever seen that specific kind of activity where a ship is digging itself underground to travel through sand in a desert.
The only other thing I have is to mention that there's the bit about talking to giant fleas. There's a line, one finds certain difficulties with phonology, notably the voiced interdental fricative. And Pynchon Wiki leaves that as the voiced dental fricative, which is not inaccurate terminologically. However, there's a slight nuance. The voiced interdental fricative is not. That is Americans and Canadians and most people who speak English in most languages. That's how you make a th sound, is by sticking your tongue either at the base of your teeth or at the tip of your teeth and blowing while going eh. An interdental fricative is much less common, and it's pretty much only used, as far as I'm aware, in received pronunciation, which makes it very funny for it to be like, this is the thing that we can't pronounce, the most broadcast accent in the world.
Huh.
And that is not and that's sticking your tongue between your teeth and blowing, essentially. However, these are fleas. Fleas don't have teeth. Fleas don't have teeth, obviously, but fleas don't have tongues. More importantly,
True.
They have essentially the equivalent of teeth. They have like little plates in their mouths. So what? Yeah, because they're bugs, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not a voiced interdental fricative in the sense that humans would use the voiced interdental fricative. What that refers to is something that would sound more like of like trying to get your teeth to buzz together.
Oh, I don't like that. Why did you use those words together?
Because that's what it is. That's what that is. Just so everyone's aware. It's a horrible sound and mental image.
So what you're saying is that bugs of this size have dinner plates in their mouth instead of regular plates.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like my sauce, or not sauce, my tea saucer, we're all used to having saucers in your mouth. Fleas, they're very, very big plates, about 10 inches.
So they're like, what's the word? I know there's a word for that. Not chelicerae, but like pedipalps almost?
No, I mean, it's like chewing mouth parts on insects are just they're like
a word for them.
They're
plates.
Yeah, they are.
Plates, yeah.
They are like plates. They're like little, like independently moving little jaws with solid things that cut. So anyway, yeah. So that's a fun mental image. It's just people going.
All right, so that does bring us to chapter 33 or chapter 19, depending upon whether or not you have access to our notes file. And this is where we get to check back in with our old pal Merle Rideout. And this chapter opens in a way that is completely emotionally devastating. I would imagine if you have children.
It's Toy Story.
Merle finds a doll that Dally used to play with, and it's sort of in that moment he realizes how old his daughter is now,
Mm-hmm.
and he begins to cry. And so he decides to start heading back towards kind of the East Coast, but he's going to end up stopping in the Midwest as he has this overriding feeling that he somehow missed something along the way in his journeys since the beginning of the book. Of course, that will eventually end up being Candlebrow University, but he starts in Audacity, Iowa, where he runs into a crowd of people who are upset at the fact that the film they were watching has broken down midway through because there's an issue with the actual projector or the camera that's playing the film. And after a brief sort of conversation with the proprietor of the establishment, Merle offers to fix the camera for him. And he sort of winds the machine back up, fixes the spring, and then sets it to go and gets a brief gig working at the movie house. I did not know that early cameras were made with watch movements that were just bigger.
Nor did I.
That's really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
Which Pynchon mentions here with the Powers movement and the regular Geneva movement. Both of these are really early film camera movements that were utilized. This is back when you had to hand crank it for the entirety of the film that was playing. Basically, the Powers movement was an improved Geneva movement, although neither of them were capable of converting to being able to run sound, so they would lapse out of use pretty quick after sound got introduced into films. This is kind of just like a self-contained aside apart from a quote here on 451 where it says, "Frankly," Fisk admitted later over a friendly glass of beer, "it has always scared the hell out of me. Too much energy loose in that little room, too much heat. Nitro in the film. Feel like it's all going to explode any minute. The stories you hear, if it was only the light, it'd be one thing, but these other forces, they gave each other the sour, resentful, tight-lipped smiles of professionals who have learned the dimensions of the payback for whatever magic is keeping the tip out in front of the happy stupor. In this case, the sheer physical labor of cranking the projector and the demonic energies a man was obliged to stand way too close to." So this is building on this sort of light theme that is existing so far in these two chapters, and that I assume continues to build over the course of, at the very least, this section of the book. So what did you guys think of this kind of aside before Merle goes to the university?
I thought it was nice. It was just a nice little like short story. It's just very sweet. You know, the opening of it is pretty heart wrenching, especially as a dad. I'm not gonna lie, that got me. And then just watching him kind of go and have this moment of like, oh, I can help, and he's the most popular man in town because he fixed the movie projector and he made a friend in the process. It's just it's a very sweet little 2-page story.
Yeah.
I did really like the use of the word valves in the first paragraph. Which that anytime that word is used in terms of like the body and stuff, it always reminds me of a confederacy of dunces and Ignatius J. Riley's constant obsession with his valve. And I would have to assume that Pynchon has read a confederacy of dunces. I mean,
I would imagine.
I have to kind of assume that. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't necessarily. I find A Confederacy of Dunces to be hilarious. It's the only book that I've ever read for the first time and then just immediately read a second time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great, it's a great way to get back in touch with Merle. And I really particularly love the final paragraph, which I won't read out right now, but it's getting into this like kind of a prefiguring of the digital revolution in filmmaking. And it's very nuanced, but essentially what he's talking about is the idea that a Geneva drive, a Geneva mechanism it's the thing that makes on a watch, essentially, it makes the It's not the exact same design, but it's basically the thing on a watch that makes the second hand stop before it goes to the next second. And in like modern day mechanical watches, it's become such a, I guess you would call it a vice signal to not have that kind of element in the watch, that's just not a thing people think about anymore. But what he's talking about is that like taking a picture is taking a picture, and taking a film is taking a bunch of a series of pictures and like trying to make it stop, trying to make the pictures stop. And he's talking about trying to shape light itself, which is truly, I can't think of a better way to do that in the modern day, except with LEDs and I guess lasers, but that's not very relevant. And it's just kind of interesting because it gets at that kind of weird idea of the way that cinema affects, like he said, the way it affects our interpretation of time, but also it gets at the way that the people who are pioneers in a field are usually also the ones who are never going to just stop working in that one field. They're going to be looking forward. And I just love that. I love seeing that with Merle because he is one of those guys, one of the few inventors in Pynchon's books that you can't like hate.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
All right. So from there, we move back to the evil institution of Candlebrow University. This would appear to be the place where Merle had forgotten about needing to go to. And so when he arrives in town, there is another meeting of the Time Travelers Festival that is actively going on. And this is where the book really, or at least this chapter anyway, kind of spirals.
That's a perfect term for it.
Literally. Yeah. In one of the lectures that he attends, there is a line that is mentioned here by the professor where it says, "Fact is, our system of so-called linear time is based on a circular, or if you like, periodic phenomenon, the Earth's own spin. Everything spins, up to and including probably the whole universe. So we can look to the prairie, the darkening sky, the earthing of a funnel cloud to see in its vortex the fundamental structure of everything." Professor? Funnel, of course, being a bit misleading as the pressure in the vortex isn't distributed in anything so simple as a straight-sided cone. Sir, excuse me, but more of a quasi-hyperaboloid of revolution, which, say, where's everybody going? And then, of course, that's when we're introduced to a tornado. I think we're all probably going to have a lot to say on this, this thing that's going to be mentioned, especially as it continues to talk about the eternal return a little bit later on. And then we get into vectors and quaternions, which I'm sure Will is just sort of raring to go on.
Yeah.
But the particular one that I want to kind of draw attention to is the first line about the fundamental structure of everything. There's a good chance that this is at least in part a reference to William Butler Yeats's theory of time as seen through the system of the gyre, or gyre. Yeats famously studied with Helena Blavatsky, once again, another very important reference and another figure who's already been referenced a number of times in this book. And he actually wrote a lot of occult texts aside from his poetry. For him, the world, and thusly time, was dictated by expanding and contracting forces of religious and secular power that form epochs of what he called gyres. Each new era, switching from religious to secular power, begins and ends with the gyration of a spiritual force, most of which is explained in his sort of foundational occult work entitled A Vision. There's a quote here that says, "A line is a symbol of time and expresses a movement symbolizing the emotional subjective mind without extension in space. A plane, cutting the line at right angles, is spatially the symbol of objectivity and intellect. A gyre is a combination of line and plane, and as one tendons or the other must always be stronger, the gyre is always expanding or contracting. The gyre is drawn as a cone, which represents sometimes the individual soul and its history, sometimes general life. For this cone, 2 cones are substituted, since neither the soul of man or nature can be expressed without conflict. He believed that every 2 millennia, one gyre would widen and the other would contract, and they were constantly spinning against one another. This leads to a point of crisis until a new civilization is born. Yeats believed that the last change had been Greco-Roman society collapsing to give way to Christianity, and saw an inevitable change coming where the moral system of Christianity would give way to something secular, which is what this poem, or his poem rather, that we read at the beginning of the show, entitled The Second Coming, is about. A new age led by what he saw would be the Antichrist spinning the gyres again. There is a real similarity here to Pynchon's theory of the forces and counterforces, in my opinion. The fighting of within these 2 forces back and forth, sort of shapes the way that history, particularly in the 20th century, has gone, but certainly historically. This idea of the force and the counterforce is not limited to the 20th century. And in that, I think there's probably some overlap with Pynchon's understanding of these cycles with what Yeats is sort of articulating in A Vision and in some of his poetry. That perhaps the change in the gyres come not in the Antichrist, but in the advent of capitalism and the age of oil, as symbolized through, the mention of Spindletop in the previous chapter. In the chapters which the destroyer comes earlier in the book, the people of New York put up a light hologram of Jesus or a savior of some kind in order to ward off the evil, but it doesn't work. The new age has come already. Maybe it's the forces and counterforces that actually cause the rotations of the gyres in the first place. In my notes, I actually drew a diagram of Yeats's gyre system. It's a bunch of triangles that are attached to one another. And in the center of that, as he kind of describes that spinning motion, is where I added a circular motion of the force and the counterforce, that as these things basically react against one another constantly, it causes these larger engines of history to change and move in different directions based upon sort of who is winning at any given time. And if you look at the end of Vineland, there's that quote from The Varieties of of Religious Experience, written by William James, where it talks about those scales of history, and how there's constant forces trying to heave the bar, and it's all of the people working against it. So the force and the counterforce is something that Pynchon's working through in a lot of his territory. And I think this is where it can find kind of a spiritual home in terms of how this broadens out to a larger historical context. That's at least my takeaway from this beginning portion until we get into the stopping gravity thing.
I'm glad you read the part you read, because that I basically circled that and made a shitload of notes in there, because I think that section is vital to explaining a lot of not just what's going on in this book, but a lot of what Pynchon gets at in a lot of his work, if not all of his work. So the description, and I am going to apologize in advance, I am not as math minded as Will is. I'm going to do my best to explain this, but his explanation, like I mentioned earlier, of quaternions is crucial to this whole thing. So when the professor talks about the Earth spinning and how time exists on a linear plane and Earth rotates on a spin, when you combine those two, that's when you get that quasi-hyperboloid. And there's a really good animation of this on the Wikipedia page for hyperboloid that shows these two planes that are connected and how the rotation of one side of that creates this funnel effect that then breaks it in the middle, like an hourglass, for lack of a better term. So you have the same thing as above, so below. And this is where that sort of intersectionality that I was talking about earlier, and this inverse of the world, that where one thing happens, there has to be the reciprocal action. When the ship goes under the sand in the desert, we have the tornado that occurs on the other side of the world where Merle is when he gets to Candlebrow. If you were to draw this on a 2D plane, if you just drew like a spiral to represent how the Earth rotates around the sun, or how the sun and the whole solar system rotate as it's moving through the universe and the galaxy, because there's a mistaken idea that sort of movement is not one dimensional necessarily, but 2-dimensional, but really it is 3-dimensional and it's always moving outward. So it creates this sort of almost like a corkscrew pattern where it's moving forward and rotating at the same time. So it's never having the intersection is never on the same plane. So if you were to draw this as a 2-dimensional spiral and then draw a line through it, you can see how. I am getting super into conspiracy corner. I should have prefaced this whole thing with that. But if you draw it out like that, you can see where you have these moments of intersectionality where this line or an event, if you will, crosses this plane, and then it as the Earth rotates and rotates around the sun and spins on its own axis, the next time it's in that same line, it's not in the same place. So you have this sort of similar thing happening, but in a different way. So that, again, that sort of duality of one thing balancing the other. So it's always happening throughout history. That got me thinking about the movie Dark City, which, if no one has seen that, that's a phenomenal film. Go watch it. It's awesome. But the general idea of that whole thing is that I don't know. It's a 30-year-old movie. The general idea behind that is that there is a world in which these beings have created this world and control time in it and are working to figure out sort of the underlying essence of the human soul or the human spirit so that they can use that to further their own lifespan because their race is dying. And in doing this, they basically reset time every 24 hours, and they will manipulate certain variables to make things happen in a different way, but still be similar at the same time. And then you have one character who kind of breaks out of that and he starts to realize what's happening with the world. The reason I mention that is because that seems very much like what's going on in a lot of Pynchon's work. There's a lot of this history repeating itself, but not necessarily in exactly the same way. It's just very similar ways because we are never able to escape that circularity and that intersectionality. So we're kind of doomed to always do that, and we've been going on this path. And so what happens is you have this balancing out that has to happen. The karmic balance on a very small scale with people, and on a much larger scale, if you blow it out to time and the universe and everything, you have these events that have to happen to work it themselves out. That's my TED Talk.
Well, so who wants to talk Hegel?
Ooh, yeah. Send me back to college.
I'm not going to talk about that much Hegel. I just want to bring up because so much Pynchon scholarship focuses for good reason on his ambivalence, I'll say kindly, toward German idealism. Hegel was a thinker who essentially took these kinds of ideas that were formulating in the 19th century of like these cycles of history, and he kind of proposed an expansion on what had been developed into like the dialectic approach of investigation. I'm not going to go into all of it. It's so dense. It's so much. I promise you, it will not be worth it to hear me try and explain what Hegel's dialectic is in any depth. Suffice to say, think about what Cody was just talking about there. Think about how through space and time, we are doomed to spiral through space in this 4-dimensional path, which both seems to cross over the same lines and expand in a dimension that doesn't seem possible, at least not in 3-dimensional space. Hegel's ideas, very short, would be best summarized as essentially taking those earlier ideas of cycles of history and those ideas of the way that thought is as he believed, is created through contradiction and negation of identity. The idea is that the Spirit of God is exercised through reason as formed by the physical, spiritual cycles of those spirals, where from our perspective as people, as individuals, or as societies within that God dialectic, we are witnessing opposition, and we are witnessing identity, contradiction, and negation. He would extend this everything from war to what both Kate and Cody were just talking about, that we are constantly perceiving these as oppositional, but in reality, what is happening is a sort of 4+ dimensional scaffolding that forms the awareness of God through our intellectual activity as people. And he would have happily expanded that beyond humans if he had any concept of animal intelligence, because he was a true mystic. But the reason I bring all this up is that while the things that have been kind of mentioned so far are the kinds of things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, the main way that most people interact with Hegel these days is in the concept of Marxism and the ways that this kind of cycling of history through these periods of conflict and sublimation and stuff kind of became equivalent to a non-ideal, non-metaphorical, non-theological basis for constructing a similar degree of, I'm going to say the bad word, teleology. And it's just so much of this book is like, is Hegel bullshit being brought out. And I think that like Yeats and these other people are great examples of more digestible forms of it. But I would also just like to add in the fun fact that James Joyce knew Yeats and basically thought of him in modern terms as a LARPer, which I just think is pretty great. I think it's very funny.
That is very funny.
Anyway, beyond the Hegel of it all, I think that one important thing to point back to is the idea of Spindletop. Spindletop, as a place where the formation of the oil hegemony started, is described as a spindle, which is what in mathematics you would use to describe the process of integrating a three-dimensional hyperboloid, because it forms a spindle shape. A spindle is a thing that helps you gather individual strands of hair and fiber into larger threads that can be joined together and straightened into a line to create string or thread or rope. Maybe not rope, but string or thread. And all of this kind of comes back to the quaternion nonsense because of the fact that this Lobachevskian function comes into play. Now, the Lobachevsky function is something that is very dense geometry. The way it's described there, I believe, is roughly accurate, but I'm not an abstract geometer. And that is a very specialized set of skills. But one really important thing to know about the Lobachevsky function is that it's considered a form of the Clausen function in a Dirichlet form, which is so, I don't know how to explain it. Anyway, so the Clausen function is foundational to what is called the Dirichlet function, which is what the Lobachevsky function is built on top of, which is, this is going to be really relevant going forward, but it doesn't mean anything right now, is viewed as kind of like the flip side of the polygamma function. And the gamma function, are any of y'all familiar with Fibonacci sequence or the the golden ratio?
Yes.
Sure.
So the one way to think about the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence is as a packing structure. You're packing a box from the middle out. You're starting with one object in the center, and then you line it with two on. You put another one next to it, and you line that with two, and then you line that with three, and so on and so forth. And that, when you dig into it, starts to form a limit onto this function that that there's kind of just this relation of numbers to numbers. There's not really a direct value, and that's called the gamma function. And the gamma function only operates on integers, on whole numbers, and I believe only positive numbers. And when you are trying to do the things that you can do very simply with quaternions, what you have to use are these kinds of trigonometric, partially differentiable equations that are in a way like setting off right corners in the way Yeats talked about on the field that you are trying to analyze. And therefore doing simple differentiation on those segments and then integrating those together by kind of just skipping a step mathematic, or at least like intuitively it feels like you're skipping a step until you really internalize how calculus functions. And it forms the basis of the need for what's known as the zeta function, which is essentially the gamma function applied to continuous fields and complex numbers. And I will leave that there because it's just not going to get any more clear, and it's not clearly relevant yet, but it will be very.
And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the zeta function is like another name for the Riemann hypothesis. Is that right?
No.
Oh, okay.
There are like a half dozen zeta functions in common usage. They all have very nuanced distinctions. The Riemann zeta function is of particular relevance to that same kind of like numbers with relation to numbers.
Okay, because I know Riemann function comes up later in the book, and I think zeta function does as well, I guess, if they're separate.
Yeah, the Riemann hypothesis is built off of the revelations of the zeta function.
Okay.
And that's like what that's doing is it's doing that kind of like breaking down the dimensions of the numbers themselves until you get down to the prime roots is kind of what's happening with the Riemann zeta function. That should be from the final episode, I think.
I tried to read a book about it a while back, and I had to put it down for two reasons, but the main one was just that it felt like I had started a video game and somehow ended up on the final boss right away. I was like, oh, okay, I don't know.
Yeah, if you can't do like three-dimensional modeling in your head, you probably shouldn't jump into the Riemann hypothesis.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way.
Did you want to read a book about the Riemann hypothesis to better understand this book, or just for fun?
That is exactly why.
Oh,
and
okay.
it turns out that the book that I had got from the library, which was considered like the kind of ultimate book about it, the guy who wrote it is a anti-Semite and a totally shithole person. So I was like, I don't want to read this anymore.
Sent that in the chat just for y'all's appreciation. That consider
this looks like if Georgia O'Keeffe did math.
Yeah. So the important thing to know about what you're looking at there is that it starts at it doesn't really start anywhere, but if you think of it as starting at the positive 0.5 end and looping through, think about the ratios of where characters are showing up in this book. I will talk about I'll try and like actually compile notes to talk about this towards the end of the book.
I kind of see where you're going with that, and I'm really interested to see how you lay all that out, because I can see it a little bit.
Literal physical dimensions.
Yeah.
How do you structure a book like that? That's just I just don't I can't do it. I would not be able to do it. I don't know how you approach doing that, because that's insane.
It is. It's absolutely wild.
And he was doing this when he was like probably in his 60s.
Well, I mean, there's general idea that he started this around the time that Gravity Rainbow was being worked as well.
Yeah.
So he may have laid the foundation of how to plot this out at that time, and then just kind of worked. And that may explain a lot of why it took so goddamn long to write.
Yeah,
if you're trying to make sure it works on this particular set of parameters, to
that's true.
it's wild.
And given that he would have started that like long ago, it makes it even crazier, not from an age perspective, but from a research perspective, because of how little information would have been accessible in the 70s, 80s
Mhm.
when he would have started working on this book.
The second image there is the red is the real component of the zeta function, and the blue is the imaginary component mapped against each other. And that one, just gonna go back to the fact that the chums of chance are fake.
I mean, I'm looking at and it just for the people listening I understand this is bad audio. I will put links to both of these images in the show notes. But yeah, I'm looking at this second one, and that makes a lot of things make a lot of sense. Like a lot of what we were just talking about this last couple of hours.
So after this gets kind of introduced, there's also, after they kind of settle back into a shelter, once the tornado shows up, there is a reference here to eternal return, which is, of course, something that exists in a lot of religious and Gnostic orders. It is also a Nietzschean idea. It exists within mythologies. These idea that processes repeat themselves over and over again. History repeats itself over and over again. We are stuck in a cycle that constantly repeats. And I don't think I need to spell out why that's related to the stuff that we just talked about.
Yeah.
Of course, this eventually does loop back around to the idea of like, well, how do we build a time machine to surf that, or potentially kind of involve ourselves in that? And then this is where we get into the mention of the vectorists, and Quaternius in attendance reminded everybody of the function they had recently worked up known as the Lobachevskian, which Will made a comment about just a couple of moments ago. And then from there, it says, we thus enter the whirlwind. It becomes the very essence of a refashioned life, providing the axis to which everything will be referred. Time no longer passes with a linear velocity, but returns with an angular one. All is ruled by the automorphic dispensation. We are returned to ourselves eternally, or if you like, timelessly. Born again! Exclaimed a Christian in the gathering, as if suddenly enlightened. I think we
jump
talked.
scare, by the way.
Yeah, you're welcome. We talked about, I believe, the idea of what a dispensation is a while back, but just to kind of like summarize, from a religious perspective, the idea of a dispensation is sort of an ordering of the cosmos and of creation and thus human life underneath a sort of set of rules set about by God. So from a Christian perspective, there are two dispensations. The first dispensation was the Old Testament, the Tanakh and the Torah. And then the current dispensation is that which was created by Jesus. And then there will be another dispensation that comes about when Jesus returns and begins to rule over a renewed earth of the millennia. That is if you're a dispensationist. I was not and am not if I was to be a sort of minister again. But that is dispensation theology. So from a perspective of this automorphic dispensation, this is an idea that if you take this out to its fullest conclusion, it is a dispensation that which gives birth to itself, in the sense that rather than being dictated by some sort of larger outside cycle or rules of order or deity, it is a dispensation that can give rise to itself, which of course adds to some of the stuff towards the end of this book with stopping time and gravity and all the rest, which we'll get to. But understand that that is kind of what they're talking about working towards, creating a version of time that no longer flows in an entropic way and instead is renewed of its own volition, and kind of freezes people in place from a perspective of how time works, but still gives them the freedom with which to create something for themselves. Now, of course, if you can do that, you can escape samsara or the eternal return or the widening and contracting gyres, or any of the different kind of models for human existence, the forces and the counter forces that we've talked about in this episode and in plenty of other episodes as well. Anyone else want to add anything there before we talk about Torvald?
I guess I'll mention it. Another way to read that paragraph that Kate just went over is less of a a promise of like some metaphysical idea which promises a material capacity for time travel or escape from history. And it can also be viewed as just we brought this thinker up way earlier in the book, or we brought this kind of class of thinkers up way earlier in the book. Luke did, at least. This is also a very symmetrical idea to what Gilles Deleuze outlines as a more grounded foundation of identity than the Hegelian construct in his work Difference and Repetition. Where this is how we found the ontology of us in a world where we can't have a stable history.
Shout out Deleuze again. I feel like we mentioned him a fair amount.
It's too direct. It's like how Wallace lied about being a Pynchon fan. Can't be pointing that much at him.
Yeah. Difference and Repetition. It's in the mail.
You are in for a headache.
Hey now.
It's a good read. I think you'll have a good headache, but
yeah. So what do we think about Torvald? Turns out that this tornado that broke up the lecture and caused them to sort of reconfigure elsewhere is the same tornado that has visited them a number of times, which they have dubbed Torvald, which is of course a longer or elongated rather name for Thor, the Norse god of thunder. What do we make of this whole thing with Torvald? This is one case where I'm not sure I can make really heads or tails of what Pynchon is trying to do there. Obviously, there's like the circular nature of a tornado with the other sort of processes that repeat themselves that we're talking about, or cycles of history, and obviously the fact that it's the same tornado coming back every time. Like all that seems in concert there, but I'm not sure what else I might be missing.
It is all of that, but it is also hilarious. It is Pynchon loves to anthropomorphize these things, whether it's a mechanical duck or a ball of lightning, but in this case, it's a giant tornado. And I love the fact that before long, the thing had been given a name, Torvald, and proprietary offerings to it had begun to appear heaped outside the university gates. Usually
Sheet
items
metal.
of sheet metal, which had been noted in particular as one of Torvald's dietary preferences. And then, what was it? There's another section for a little further down where superstition screams certain professors. How are we supposed to maintain any scientific objectivity around here? And yet, suppose we did try to communicate with Thorvald. Oh, it's Thorvald now, my quite chummy, aren't we? Well, it is cyclic after all, so also some kind of signaling might be possible using wave modulation. And then a cult develops around it because of course it does. And people just start grifting other people and taking advantage of them and hawking products related to it. It's just brilliant. I love it. It's that highbrow, lowbrow kind of thing.
I did find this part funny too. I'm not exactly sure why I started the episode by saying that I didn't find any of it funny.
It's there. You just got to find it.
Yeah. So after this kind of occurs, Merle decides that he's going to become basically a regular at Candlebrow. And so he starts attending the conferences, and he starts kind of assisting with people when he can, and going in and out of these different bazaars that form at different times where people are hawking sort of inventions and, things that claim to be inventions that actually aren't. And eventually this brings them back in touch with the inconvenience. And it's not Roswell Bounce that didn't see the mustache. It is Merle that was having a hard time identifying Chick through the mustache. But they kind of reconnect. And this is just one of those weird things where, like, the last time they saw each other was in 1892 at the World's Fair. And just from a standpoint of how far this book has gone, it's just another illustration of just how much ground has been covered in like a pretty
Mhm.
crazy way. In the same way as when Dally first showed up as the powder monkey at the gold mine. Even that feels a while ago now
Yeah.
from where we are.
Well, and I love the subtle nod to them being characters, because he doesn't say last time I saw you. He said last time I read about you.
Yeah.
It was, so it's still like we're just hammering home this idea that they are characters and real people at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And this is where we are also sort of given a checkup back on Roswell Bounce, of course, the creator of the Hypops apparatus. You can read about that and his struggle with the Vibe Corporation all the way back on page 67. A cool nearly 400 pages ago.
And over a calendar year ago.
Yes, yeah, if you really want to go back and listen to us talk about page 67. And it turns out that this whole legal struggle over the Hypops apparatus really captured a lot of people's imaginations in the nation as they read about it and as it kind of went on. And this is where we get into, again, another kind of birth of this new age of the 20th century, this litigious nature that some people have. And if we're talking about bilocations, this first chapter we talked about opens with the mania for marriage, and this chapter is sort of working its way towards a close with a mention of a mania for litigiousness, or a mania for lawsuits. So another way in which these two chapters are kind of in direct conversation or connection with one another. All before Roswell basically says that he might plan to blow up the Vibe Corporation in some way as kind of a final, fuck you to the people who ripped him off. Do we have any thoughts on that before we get into stopping the clock?
There was one funny part that was in here when Merle's talking to Roswell Bounce. He says, "And what steps are you taking," Merle inquired, "to make sure you don't end up wandering around the badlands of our fair republic, raving about lost mines and so forth?" "I'm heading to California," replied Roswell. "Well, that ought to help some," said Merle. Just a lovely little dig at Californians.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Texan of you, Cody.
I know, right? I can say it because I'm not in Texas anymore.
Yeah.
I do just, you mentioned it, Kate, but I just want to draw the line. I want to underline it because look, we have evidence that some of our listeners can't connect dots. The guy who has the massive law firm on retainer does not have paranoia Carolans, but this one guy who's being taken advantage of by the guy with the retained law team does have paranoia Carolans.
Yes. Good call elucidating that difference. Torvald arrives again to wreak havoc and accept his sacrifices. And Merle is in the midst of a conversation with good old Roswell Bounce. And as they kind of get into it, there is one really funny line in here that I loved on 456 of, "Off they went, forgetting about the imminent cyclone. Thorvald hovered over them for a moment as if trying to analyze how murderous it might be feeling today. Then, briefly slowing and resuming speed, being the tornadic equivalent of a shrug, moved on to more promising prey." And this is where we bring up light again. Does somebody want to read the quote beneath that Roswell confesses?
"I want to know light," Roswell was confessing. "I want to reach inside light and find its heart, touch its soul, take some in my hands, whatever it turns out to be, and bring it back, like the gold rush, only more at stake maybe, because it's easier to go crazy from. There's danger in every direction, deadlier than snakes or fever or claim jumpers." "And what steps are you taking," Merle inquired, "to make sure you don't end up wandering around the badlands of our fair republic, raving about lost mines and so forth?" "Yeah, I'm heading to California." "That ought to help some," said Merle. "I'm serious. It's where the future of light is, in particular the moving pictures. The public loves those movies, can't get enough of them. Maybe that's another disease of the mind. But as long as nobody finds a cure for it, the sheriff will have to keep settling for trail dust in my case." There sure is projectionist. Sorry, did you want me to stop earlier?
No, you're fine. I think that it's just important that, again, this is another instance of light as a spiritual force, or light as some sort of animating force for good that they're talking about wanting to break into. That is a very Manichaean idea. very relevant to the chapters that we have been reading. So thank you.
Yeah.
This, of course, does start a conversation about watches, though, the worship of the Geneva movement. And they start talking about something called a tourbillon, which is the most expensive, well, not exactly the most expensive. I don't remember the name of it now, but there's a watch complication that will like ring a bell to tell you what time it is in hours, minutes, and seconds. It's especially prized by blind folks who can't read the face of the watch. But a tourbillon is one of the most expensive complications you can have in a watch. And what they describe here as far as how it works and why it was created is very accurate to history. So I don't need to kind of recount that. You guys can just read it as it's written there. And then this brings up this brief interaction after that where it says, make gravity impervious to time. Why? Roswell shrugged. It's that one-way business again. They're both forces that act in one direction only. Gravity pulls along the third dimension up to down. Time pulls along the fourth, birth to death. Rotate something through space-time so it assumes all positions relative to the one-way vector time. There you go. And so this is where I kind of already started to get into this with the previous mention of what they were talking about in terms of the Yates and of being able to create this like self-generating dispensation. But this is really the crux of these references that I think Pynchon is making to time and existence and all the spirituality of these two chapters, that if gravity represents, in a thematic sense, our lived reality or life on Earth, the things that are inevitable, if we want to connect it to the book that he wrote that has gravity in the title, then making it resistant to time would effectively be to stop those cycles of eternal return, stop the cycles of forces and counterforces, stop the gyres from spinning and the epochs from turning. Now, of course, this is heavily dependent on when you stop the flow of time. Within the lens of Against the Day, you may want to make sure this happens before World War I comes to pass. If you do that, then you may be able to stop the worst of the new capitalist age from beginning, starting with the sort of new Yeatsian epoch that's going to pass once World War I happens, within the book anyway. Perhaps more importantly, you'd stop the flow of light from seeping back into heaven, which would keep us at a set level of divinity in the Manichaean sense that wouldn't ever get any lower. From a strictly historical, non-fictional perspective, all of this ephemera and occult knowledge that Pynchon has been building towards fruition in these chapters, with all of the kind of secret societies and all of that he talked about a couple hundred pages ago, seems to be pointing towards this idea that like there was a sense that something was going wrong. Like you read through a lot of these different aspects of historical figures, of what countries were motivated to engage in, of what individual like people were motivated to engage in through research projects and scholarship, through what different, Theosophical Society members or different secret societies are working towards, what occult beliefs are working towards, that there was like this sense that there was something in the air. Something was coming down the pike that was bad, that was evil, that was dark, that was really going to twist the direction that we were headed in. That is sort of a fundamental through line in a lot of these different references that Pynchon is making, and especially as the 19th century wanes away and we are given the 20th century, you see that a lot of these like thinkers and mathematicians that did have weird ties to, Theosophical societies or investigative societies or occult societies stopped having those associations, and they moved just directly into, working for the government or working towards a secular end. That passes away, but really the last gasp of that seems to indicate that like something bad is happening, and that some change was coming on the horizon that would lead to, as I mentioned, like a darker, eviler age if we didn't manage to change the course that we were on. Clearly, we weren't able to do that. And it seems from the perspective of this book anyway, that the kind of illustration of that, of what is going to happen there, is World War I, and what that sort of thematically represents to the vertical integration, the creation of the capital T, the powers that be, and what they're interested in. And that kind of as soon as that happens, it's the sort of Pandora's box is open, right? Like going back to the sort of epistolary chapter of the book, like the destroyer is here. And you can put up all the light that you want. You can put up the image of the savior that you want, but it doesn't change the fact that the destroyer is here. When they return to New York, the here is the gate to the Woeful City is still there. That you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. And so all of this talk about stopping time, of trying to kind of reverse the flow of that, it's almost too little too late. The process has started. Maybe you can keep the worst of it from coming, but you can't keep it, from ever showing up. And so then, of course, I think the question becomes, what is important? And I think that what Pynchon has illustrated through the rest of his career is that what's important is the person that's standing next to you, and what you do for that individual person. But that's really kind of what I come out of these chapters with, is this idea that historically there was some sort of fear of something evil and dark coming down the pike, that if you manage to stop it through these spiritual systems, through what they're talking about, you would maybe be able to keep some of it at bay, but certainly not all of it. And so there is the inherent implication of what comes next once you realize that the worst has come to pass.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. And I think that's evident in more than just this book too, especially your mention of coming out of it with someone else, that at the end of the day, that's ultimately what's important, because really a lot of these grander machinations and things, like, like you said, they're set in motion. There's really nothing we can do to stop them. We can only kind of prevent the worst from happening. But if you look at his other works, especially his post-Gravity's Rainbow works, where the endings are a little bit more optimistic, Vineland and Mason and Dixon and Bleeding Edge, especially, like, the ending of those books is, somebody coming out, finding they found someone or a couple other people in Bleeding Edge's case that gave them purpose and meaning and helped them get through those things. And despite the fact that they maybe weren't able to stop the worst of what was coming, they at least still have those people with them.
Yeah, and it could be that I have recently watched Inherent Vice, and Inherent Vice is really kind of hyper focused on that idea that you're articulating and that I kind of mentioned, that instead of trying to adapt the whole book, it's trying to get down to the sort of dock and coy of it all. But I think that book I'd like to reread sooner rather than later, probably before we do it for the podcast, because it really feels like part of the through line of that is, like, in this vertically integrated system that is vaster than your comprehension, that you can't really push back against, certainly not if you're just like one sort of hippie remnant living out on the beach, that really all you do have left to pursue is, like, in Doc's case, how do I keep little kid blues from happening, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is the one kind of concrete thing that I can do? And I think it's interesting that his bigger works, like Gravity's Rainbow, like this, and I could be wrong, I haven't finished reading this book, obviously, seem focused on the sort of impossibility and inevitability of those systems as they create themselves, with, the implications inherent to what that means for the individual human needing to be felt in the reader as opposed to on the page. And then these smaller, less dense encyclopedic works that he's writing are about people navigating those systems that are created through inevitability by his mammoth works that he wrote. Like, I think that the way that these books are in conversation with one another has really, really come to fruition in my understanding of his work as we've gone through Against the Day, but particularly as we've gone through, I would say, the last 100 pages of this book in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in the broad strokes, I think you're pretty much on the dot. I've got needles to pick prod. I'm sure you'll have some to prod into yourself. But just to go back to the text, I guess, in front of us, I would like to mention that what's happening with the talk of Tourbillon and talking about the ideas of, rotating through space-time so it assumes all positions relative to vector time. This is almost like, obviously it's kind of like a prefiguration of Einstein's theories of relativity, and it kind of gets at what I think is maybe the flaw in the thinking of Roswell here and the other people at Candlebrow, where they're talking about this as though you can traverse all of space-time without being part of the time continuum. And what we know as people who exist in a world where there's time drift between satellites and on the surface of the Earth is that the gravity is not separate. The gravity is not separate from the time, and that the dimensionality is part of whatever this process is that we call time.
That like time is almost, I guess, to make a simple point, that time is effectively an illustration of the effects of gravity on like a human body or on something.
Well,
not I know that that's not scientifically accurate, but like
you
are correct in that they're wrong. They're wrong in their concept of time and gravity's relationship to each other.
Almost in the context of Against the Day, in the pseudoscience that we're working with, it's almost like it's saying that light constructs the time, and that by passing the gravity over it as we know it, it's more like the gravity is the shaping of the time around the physical objects almost.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's why if you take some of these things to their like ultimate conclusion of, these autonomic dispensations or finding some kind of way to stop time, like it doesn't work, right? And I think it doesn't work on purpose because, as you're talking about, it is flawed thinking by the people who are at Candlebrow. And I think I don't know, I think it's interesting if I want to extrapolate off the top of my head in a completely kind of free associative way. I think it's interesting that effectively within that pseudoscientific framework, they're trying to use science to solve a spiritual problem, which like you can't. That these cycles of history or the kind of capitalist violence that this book is analyzing the rise of is not something that you can utilize science to fix. You need to it needs to be something that you address within yourself, within the kind of motivations that if you are a capital holder that you have to engage in. No math or science or time machine or invention is going to fix that problem. It's an individual issue.
Well, and this is more of a personal thing, targeting you, Kate, but also just like the way that people read Pynchon in general. I think it's an error to read him as a Manichaean. I do think that to appeal to earlier, more spurious Gnostic traditions, that's the worm eating its own tail. That's buying in to the myth, I think.
Yeah, I think and I guess I did kind of say like it's clear that Pynchon believes in this somewhat. I think it's clear he believes in it for the purpose of writing a book,
sure.
not in the sense that he is articulating that you should convert to these things.
No, I was referring more to your extrapolation of how the relation between his fiction and history, I guess.
Sure, I gotcha.
Yeah, that's all. And then I guess back to the text, something to note is that the Harrison clock showed up in Mason and Dixon. And the Harrison clock was the attempt to essentially solve this same kind of problem, but in the context of tides and waves on a ship. And so this tourbillon is symbolic evolution and literal evolution of those same mechanics. And the ironic part is that as soon as we figured out the tourbillon, not as soon as, but when we figured out the tourbillon, we very shortly afterwards figured out that, special relativity and general relativity are things. And we very soon had people going to the moon or being in orbit. And I tell you, none of those astronauts or cosmonauts were wearing watches with tourbillons because it turns out on that scale, it doesn't matter. And that kind of gets at something too, I think. I'm not sure what, but it does get at something.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's also just points to the fact that like that is an invention that was intended to solve like an issue, and when you put it into the like application environment where it would in theory solve the issue, it doesn't do anything. And like I think that gets back to, maybe I'm just going down the same rabbit hole again, but like the idea that like these systems or these things you try to create to solve issues that are not solvable through mechanics or through mathematics or science or whatever, that you need to find a solution in a different way. Now, of course, that doesn't
Mhm.
totally map to something like a tourbillon because of how those things operate, but it reminds me of the same thing. And maybe that's a flawed reading on my part.
Well, it connects in the sense that the tourbillon's movement across the field of gravity works metaphorically similarly to the way that it's running across this field of gravity through time, and it's kind of it's doing the Dirichlet series. It's doing the uh, Fourier transform. It's doing partial derivative functions on time in a very literal sense through the processing of the spring's mechanism against the escapement. And it all ties together very directly because of the way that it is like all of this mathematical stuff lining up in a physical form.
Now they just put them in watches because they look cool.
They're really pretty.
Yeah.
And the Chinese manufacturers figured out how to make them pretty cheap. So, it's a thing.
That sort of transitions us to the lecture at the very last lecture that's given by Herman Minkowski, which you sort of already kind of alluded to, Will, with the fact that Minkowski was key to developing relativity and how those early developments in relativity expose a few things. I would assume that you have thoughts on this last sort of lecture that he gives before the end of the chapter.
I mean, I don't really. We've kind of digested everything that I would mention in broad
Okay.
strokes over the past like year and a half.
Fair. I mean, it does feel like a lot of this stuff is like earlier things coming to fruition in a very, like, that's what these two chapters really feel like to me.
Yeah, I mean, it really is like, okay, W.B. Yeats is a poet, and okay, poets are cranks. Okay, he's talking about vortices and gyres. Okay, cool. But no, Herman Minkowski was one of the most important people in the field at the time, and he's a mystic. He's a nut job in the same way that Tesla was, I guess.
Yeah.
It's really all I have to say.
All right. Do we have anything else that we want to talk about in this chapter before we start to wrap up? Cody, did you give all of your theories and all of your suppositions that you had prepared?
I did. Yes, I got it
Nice.
all out in that whirlwind of explanation.
I did want to go back to 454 for a bit in a specific paragraph. It's kind of a longer paragraph. My voice might give out, but I'm just going to read it out loud. Soon enough, quicker than he would have thought. This is Merle, is the he. So soon enough, quicker than he would have thought, he became a fixture at the summer get-togethers. The rest of the year, it was like one day job after another, just so for a month during the summer he could enter a realm of time obsession and share with others of the breed. It never occurred to him to question how this preoccupation had come about, whether by way of photography and its convergence of silver, time, and light, or just with Dally out of the house, finding time so heavy on his hands that he was obliged to bring it a little closer to his face, squint at it from different angles, maybe try to see if it could be taken apart to figure how it might actually work. From here on, the alchemy, the tinkering, the photography would be relegated to day jobs of one kind or another. The nights, the flights, and journeys proper to night will be dedicated to the mysteries of time. I mean, that last sentence especially is really beautiful. There's some good prose in that section and in that paragraph in general. That last section, the last sentence rather, does kind of bring to mind the title of this book, The Nights, the Flights, and Journeys Proper to Night. Those would be all things that would be in some way or another, I mean, at least vaguely against the day, or, like proper to the night. So not, so the opposite of the day, I guess. But I did want to kind of focus on the kind of middle of middle of that paragraph where it talks about how like Merle would do all this other stuff for 1 month out of the year. He would go to Candlebrow and really like delve into time and the different academic, I'm sure academic and non-academic views on time. But I had a professor in my undergrad who was a Shakespeare scholar. I don't really know how prominently he's been published as a Shakespeare scholar. I know that he's been published at least some, but I don't know if it's like I really have no idea if I were to meet another Shakespeare scholar if they would know who he was. But this guy who's very passionate about Shakespeare, he's the only professor who taught Shakespeare at my undergrad. But he would spend his summers in England going to performances of like Shakespeare and spending time at like a Shakespeare conference that happened every year. And you could just tell from the way he talked about it that, because my undergrad was in Abilene, Texas. It's a conservative Christian college. And I don't think all the professors there were conservative Christians. I mean, I think that more or less all of them were Christian. I mean, I don't really know, and we don't need to go off on that tangent. But you could tell that like his real life, like like that, what he looked forward to throughout the semester, the fall and the spring semester was his summers in England, and that was like what he was actually passionate about, was hanging out with other Shakespeare scholars and getting to see top actors, do Shakespeare performances and stuff. So it just reminded me of that. And I mean, I used to go to summer camp. There was something kind of special about having that every year. You'd see a lot of the same people, and it just kind of reminds me of that. Different aspects of growing up. I also would travel for the month of July and do mission work with my family a lot during the summers, and it was kind of like a second life, or like it was an opportunity for me to be different than I was at home. And I don't know. I think y'all get what I'm getting at. But I find myself thinking about that paragraph a lot in retrospect after I first reread these 2 chapters for the podcast.
All right. So, was there any funny parts that we did not go over as we covered the information?
Got all of mine, I think.
Did we mention the pussy vagina thing? I can't remember.
Yes, I brought that up.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that
was pretty
part.
funny. Yeah.
All right. So that brings us to quotes. Does anyone have one that they want to throw out there?
I'm thinking all of mine were talked about already.
I do have one we didn't go over.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else has any.
I've got one.
We got one.
All right. I'll go first, I guess. Mine's on 436. Top of 436. Such to the dead might appear the world of the living, charged with information, with meaning, yet somehow always just, terribly, beyond that faithful limit where any lamp of comprehension might beam forth. The hum of the viscosity equipment rose and fell, and what had come to sound more and more like purposeful melody, reminding veterans of duty on the Himalayan station of transmundane melody performed upon ancient horns fashioned from the thigh bones of long-departed priests in wind-beaten lamaseries miles above the level of a sea at this distance belonging more to legend than geography. I don't know. I don't really. I just find that passage beautiful, especially the beginning and the end of that paragraph, or those set of sentences.
Definitely.
The ancient horns fashioned from the thigh bones of long departed priests.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very memorable.
Agreed. That's a great quote. Mine is 457. It says, "The usual thing. The day-by-day politics of this conference would have made an average recital of Balkan history seem straightforward as a joke told in a saloon. Over in the theoretician's shop, nobody, however wise-looking, was able to avoid the combinations, coups, schisms, betrayals, disillusions, misread intentions, lost messages that writhed and crept below the cheery blandness of this Midwestern campus. But the mechanicians understood each other. At the end of the summer, it would be these hard-headed tinkers with their top-sidedly healed fractures, scars, and singed-off eyebrows, chronically short-tempered before the creation's irreducible cussedness, who'd come out of these time travelers' clam bakes with any practical kind of momentum, and when the professors had all gone back to their bookshelves and proteges and intriguings after this or that Latinate token of prestige, it'd be the engineers who figured out how to keep in touch. What telegraphers and motor expressmen to trust, not to mention sheriffs who wouldn't ask too many questions, Italian fireworks artists who'd come in and cover for them when the townsfolk grew suspicious of night horizons. Where to find the discontinued part, the exotic ore, the local utility somewhere on Earth able to generate them current with the exact phase or frequency or sometimes simple purity that would meet their increasingly inscrutable needs. I just really love that as like a artistic illustration of the idea of theory versus practice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just rendered really, really beautifully by Pynchon's prose there.
Will, do you want to go next or do you want to go last?
I can go next.
Okay.
Mine's short. Mine's simple. Mine's sweet. Not that sweet. 434, 2/3 of the way down. It is little resembled the upper world view of the desert as the depths of the ocean to its own surface. Enormous schools of what might have been some beetle species swarmed, as if curious, iridescently in and out of the searchlight beams, while too far away to examine in any detail. In some cases, indeed, well past the smeared boundaries of the visible, darker shapes kept pace with the ship's progress, showing now and then a flash, bright as unsheathed steel. Presently, according to the charts, felt more than seen, there rose to port and starboard the jagged mountain ranges known to longtime inter-Asian sand dogs as the Deep Blavatsky. And, like I said, not all that deep, but it's I don't know, it feels very, very, very reminiscent of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea in a way that is, nice. I'm not a fan of Jules Verne, so the fact that it makes me feel good to be reminded of that book says something about that passage.
That's a good one. I almost went with that one. Mine is on 446. This is where Inspector Sands and Gasparo are having their kind of back and forth run at each other. Cries of "there he goes" and "hold up, you bloody anarchist" were absorbed in the relentless polyrhythms of the steam machinery. Against the greased writhing of these dark iron structures, a bright work of brass fittings and bindings, kept ashine through the nights by a special corps of unseen chars, flashed like halos of industrious saints in complex periodic motion everywhere. Hundreds of telegraphers ranked about the great floor, attending each his set, scarcely looked up from their universe of clicks and rests. Uniformed messenger boys came and went among the varnished hardwood labyrinth of desks and sorting bureau, and customers leaned or paced, puzzled over messages they had just received or must send, as cheerless London daylight descended through the windows, and rising steam produced an all but tropical humidity in this northern temple of connection. I love a good chase scene, and that is such a brilliantly written one of, the kind of typical like running through a crowded office or a crowded building while someone's chasing you. But it's just so well done, and it adds so much fun to an already fun scene.
Believe it or not, that was my second choice.
Oh, really? Nice.
Yeah, so that brings us to the most Pynchon part of the chapter. What do we think?
Part of me is really tempted to put the Mario and Luigi joke in there, because that's
probably fair.
Nested joke. I think I'm going to go with that.
Go for it.
I'll break sequence and I'll say that my most Pynchon part is the fact that they figure out the encryption. They figure out how to decode the encryption. They figure out how to literally look at the map. And then they get almost to wherever the hell they think they're supposed to be going. And they're like, well, I guess lens aberration or something. It's really great. It's the kind of anticlimax most authors are afraid to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess my most Pynchon part is I talked about this in the opening a little bit, but just the opening of this section. I mean, I feel like a lesser author would want to ease his reader, his or her or their reader, into a new section, and instead we get a flashback and then a flash forward, and then we get some stuff that kind of fills in the gap between the two, where, if you're taking a break between section 2 and section 3 like we did, it can be a little much to deal with at the beginning. I enjoy it. I think it's fun to figure out what's going on, but to kind of puzzle it out. It's not a terribly difficult puzzle, I would say, but it is a bit of a puzzle. But it's just, I found that to be a very Pynchonian thing to do.
Definitely.
Man, Pynchon part of the chapter is hard. This one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just going to Corvald as a character. Just the idea
Yeah.
of a seemingly semi-sentient tornado that a cult develops around and that people leave sort of offerings to. Yeah. The sheet metal joke is a particularly really good one. Yeah, I would say that's going to be my choice. So, we have one email that we received. Does someone want to read Jeremy's listener question?
I've got it right here. It says, "Good afternoon, guys. I wanted to wish you all a happy postmarked West Day, June 12th. Sorry we're getting to this so late, but yeah, recording is weird. I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, so Pynchon's Mason and Dixon really kindled an interest in local history for me. I just wrapped up your discussion of Mason and Dixon, so I wanted to take the time to thank you for your commentary. I'm usually too erratic a reader to survive a book club. I'm either way ahead or way behind, but listening to your old episodes allows me to participate at my own pace. I'm starting Infinite Jest now, so hopefully I'll be caught up by the time you finish. Take care." Thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate that. As someone who recently moved to the Del Val area, I love that it's situated in such an important part of that history. I came up to Philadelphia a couple years ago. Right, I think we were doing Mason and Dixon at the time, and I went down to where they had landed in South Philly and took some pictures there. And I constantly am like finding myself talking to people from the area about like just the weird, obscure history of all of that, and it's become just a really interesting part of my life now. And again, I say this every time I think we talk about Mason and Dixon, but that whole series would not have been possible if it wasn't for Brett. His knowledge and his willingness to collaborate with us was instrumental in us really understanding that book in the way that we did.
Agreed. Well, next episode, we're going to be reading pages 460 through 488. Cool, 28 pages, which is going to comprise chapters 34 through 35. And if you like what you're doing and you want to support the show, if you think our show is worth $1, we would love to have it. Please consider making a donation on Ko-Fi. Funds that we receive there are going to be used to upgrade our equipment and primarily pay our hosting fees, but just generally make the make the show better. Help make the show better. Jesus Christ. If you enjoyed our discussion, there is, of course, going to be media related to all of the different things we referenced that you can find links to down in the show notes. And if you want to get in touch with us in the same way that Jeremy Baramy here has done, you can email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are available to be found on Blue Sky at Mapping the Zone, on Twitter at PinchOnPod, on Instagram at Mapping the Zone Podcast. And as always, thank you for listening.
Bye.
Yeah.
Yeah, buddy.